Tonight, we begin a calm trip into the heart of Zen Buddhism. These are not hard lessons or difficult tricks to learn. They are simple truths about what it means to be a person, discovered by masters who spent their lives learning how to find deep, steady peace. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. For over 2,000 years, this old wisdom has helped countless people find out something amazing. No matter what storms happen around us, it is possible to stay very calm inside. No matter how others treat us, we can choose how we answer them. Tonight, you don't need to try to understand these truths. Simply let them settle into your mind as you rest, and they will naturally begin to make their quiet change inside you. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow down. Simply rest here and let these old truths carry you gently into peace. High in the mountains of ancient China stood a small temple called Clear Mountain Temple. The buildings were plain, made of old wood and grey stone, their curved roofs designed to let the heavy mountain snow slide off. A young monk named Jin Chan had travelled many days to reach this faraway place. He had heard stories of the master here, an old monk who seemed unbothered by life's problems. People said nothing could disturb his peace. Not mean words, not praise, not even being hurt seemed to affect his inner calm. Jinshan badly wanted to learn this secret. The master of Clear Mountain Temple was called Wui. His face was crinkled like old tree bark, his eyes clear as mountain pools. When Jinshan knelt down and begged to learn the biggest secrets of inner peace, Master Wui gently stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. "You wish to become unshakeable?" the master asked. "Yes, master. I have studied many tricks, but I still find myself upset by every small thing. A mean word from another monk ruins my day. Bad weather makes me cranky. Even the sound of someone chewing loudly can destroy my quiet time. I feel weak and unstable." Master Wu nodded slowly. "I understand your problem, but before I can teach you anything, you must complete a simple job." He pointed through the wooden window toward the towering peak across the valley. "Do you see Thunder Peak Mountain? I want you to watch it during the next storm. Don't try to meditate or practice any trick. Simply watch with your full attention." Jinshan looked confused. "Master, how will watching a mountain help me become stronger inside?" "Mountains have much to teach those who pay attention," Wui replied with a gentle smile. "Trust the plan." 3 days later, dark clouds began gathering around the mountain peaks. The wind picked up, sending prayer flags flapping wildly outside the temple windows. Soon, the storm arrived with huge force. Jinshan positioned himself by the window and watched. Lightning split the sky like angry dragons dancing between the peaks. Thunder rolled through the valleys so loud it seemed the mountains themselves were crying out. Rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see across the valley. The wind howled with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Yet through all this fury, Thunder Peak Mountain remained perfectly still. Lightning struck its summit again and again, lighting up the ancient rock face in brilliant flashes of white light. The wind threw everything it had against the massive stone walls. Rivers of water poured down its sides, making temporary waterfalls that appeared and disappeared like magic. But the mountain itself never moved. It didn't fight against the lightning or push back the driving rain. It simply remained what it had always been, solid and unmoved, letting the entire storm rage around its unchanging presence. The storm continued for 2 days and 2 nights. When it finally passed, leaving the air crystal clear and sweet with the smell of rain-washed pine, Jinshan went to find Master Wui. He discovered the old monk sitting in the garden, quietly tending to small plants that had been knocked about by the storm. "Master," Jinshan said, bowing respectfully. "I watched Thunder Peak throughout the entire storm. I think I understand something, but I would be grateful for your guidance." Wui looked up from a small pine seedling he was gently supporting with a thin bamboo stick. "Tell me what you saw." The mountain remained completely peaceful even in the fiercest storm I have ever witnessed. Nothing could disturb what it truly was. The lightning, the wind, the flooding rain, it all passed around the mountain without changing it in any way. And why do you think this was possible? The master asked, his hands still gentle on the young tree. Jin Shan thought carefully before answering. Because the mountain knew exactly what it was. It wasn't confused about its nature. It wasn't trying to be a tree that could bend or a bird that could fly away. It was simply, completely itself. And somehow its roots went so deep that nothing could shake it. Beautiful, Master Wui said, his eyes warm with approval. The mountain shows us the first secret of true strength. It comes not from fighting against what life brings us, but from knowing who we are so deeply that outside storms cannot touch our core. He stood slowly brushing soil from his robes. You came seeking tricks for inner peace. But peace is not something you create through effort. It's what you discover when you stop being confused about your own nature. But Master, how do I find this deep knowing? The same way the mountain found its nature, we replied. Not through thinking or analyzing, but through patient sitting, through going through many storms, through simply being present with whatever shows up. Your true self is not something you build. It's what remains when everything fake is worn away. This old story reveals something deep about human nature that we often forget in our busy, complicated lives. Beneath all our worries, our changing feelings, our fears about what others think of us, there exists something solid and unchanging. The mountain represents this deeper part of ourselves. Most of us live our lives thinking of ourselves as surface things. We think we are our job title, our friendships, our successes and failures, our good days and bad days. When these things go well, we feel strong. When they don't, we feel shaken. We're like trees with shallow roots, easily blown over by the first strong wind. But what if there was something deeper? What if the real you, the part that watches your thoughts come and go, the part that has remained the same throughout all the changes of your life, what if that part was as solid and unshakable as a mountain? This is what the Buddha discovered when he sat quietly and looked deeply into the nature of human experience. He found that beneath all the mental noise and emotional storms, there is a place of profound stillness that cannot be touched by outside events. Not because it's hiding from life, but because it's so deeply rooted in truth that nothing can disturb it. When we learn to know ourselves from this deeper place, everything changes. Mean words still come, but they cannot shake us because we're no longer depending on other people's approval for our sense of worth. Problems still arise, but they become like weather passing through our awareness rather than threats to our very existence. This isn't about becoming cold or disconnected from life. The mountain isn't separate from the storm. It experiences every lightning strike, every drop of rain, but it experiences these things from such a place of deep stability that they cannot overwhelm its essential nature. This is the foundation that makes all other peace practices possible. When you know you have this unshakable core, you can afford to be kind when others are cruel, because their cruelty cannot touch what you truly are. You can afford to stay calm in chaos because your peace doesn't depend on outside order. You can afford to love without being sure of being loved back because your completeness doesn't depend on getting something from others. In the hills outside Kyoto during the early spring when cherry blossoms painted the mountainsides, pale pink, stood an ancient temple called Eternal Light. The temple had served travelers for over 300 years, offering shelter, food, and spiritual guidance to anyone who needed it. The temple's keeper was an old monk named Dogen, named after a great master from centuries past. He was a thin man with kind eyes and hands that were permanently stained from years of working in the temple gardens. Dogen had lived at Eternal Light for 40 years, maintaining the buildings, tending the gardens, and keeping the temple lamp burning every single night without fail. One spring evening, a traveling merchant named Tishi arrived at the temple gates. Tishi was a successful trader who dealt in silk and tea, traveling regularly between the great cities. He was also a restless man, always seeking new chances, better deals, more profitable routes. He had never understood why anyone would choose a life of simple service when they could be out in the world getting rich and famous. After sharing the evening meal in the temple's humble dining hall, Tishi sat with Dogen on the wooden porch overlooking the valley below. The mountain air was cool and sweet, with the scent of blossoming trees. Evening shadows were beginning to stretch across the landscape. "Honorable monk," Tishi said, setting down his teacup, "I hope you don't find my question rude, but I have always wondered about men like you. You are clearly intelligent and capable. You could live in the capital, teach wealthy students, perhaps even serve in a rich family's household. Why choose such a simple, lonely life?" Dogen was quiet for a long moment, listening to the evening sounds wind through bamboo, the distant call of a temple bell, water flowing over stones in the garden stream. Finally, he gestured toward the valley spread below them. "Do you see the small lights beginning to appear in the village?" he asked. Takashi looked where Dogen pointed. In the gathering dusk, warm yellow lights were beginning to glow in windows throughout the valley. Cooking fires, oil lamps, candles, each one a small beacon of human life continuing its daily rhythm. "Yes, I see them," Tishi replied. "Every evening for 40 years, Dogen said, I have lit the lamp in our temple hall, in storms that rattled these old buildings like toys, in snow so deep I could barely reach the hall, in sickness and in health. I have never once failed to light it." As if to illustrate his point, Dogen rose and moved to a large bronze oil lamp that stood in a corner on the porch. With practiced movements born of decades of repetition, he cleaned the wick, filled the reservoir with oil, and lit the flame. Immediately, warm light spread across the porch and out into the garden, pushing back the approaching darkness. "That light," Dogen continued, settling back down beside Tishi, "serves as a beacon for travelers who lose their way in these mountains. But more than that, it represents something essential about what it means to be human." A nightbird called from somewhere in the darkness, its voice clear and solitary. Fireflies began to blink among the garden plants like tiny stars fallen to earth. "You ask why I choose this life," Dogen said. "But I think the question itself misses something important. I don't experience this as choosing limitation. I experience it as choosing to give my life meaning." Tishi was beginning to understand, but Dogen continued. "Every night when I light that lamp, I'm answering the deepest question a human being can ask. How can my life serve something greater than my own small wants and fears?" He pointed to the temple lamp, its flame steady and bright in the gathering darkness. "That light burns not for me, but for anyone who might need it. The merchant traveling late, the pilgrim who has lost the path, the local farmer walking home after dark. My purpose is to ensure that light never fails when someone needs it." Tishi looked out at the valley, where more and more lights were appearing as families lit their evening lamps and cooking fires. For the first time, he saw not just individual households going about their business, but a web of human care and service. Each light represented someone choosing to push back a little darkness to create a small space of warmth and safety in the vast night. "I have spent my life accumulating things," Tishi said quietly. "Silk, tea, gold, reputation, but none of these things have given me the peace I see in your face. How do you find such peace in having so little?" Dogen smiled. "I think you see it backwards, my friend. I don't have little. I have everything that truly matters. I have work that serves others. I have days filled with meaning. I have the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing my life makes a difference, even if it's a small one." The next morning, as Teishi prepared to continue his journey, he watched Dogen move through his morning routines. He saw him carefully clean the lamp from the night before, trim the wick, and prepare it for another evening of service. He watched him tend the temple gardens, sweep the pathways, and prepare simple meals for any travelers who might arrive. For the first time in his life, Tishi glimpsed something that his constant seeking for personal advantage had never shown him. He saw a man who had found perfect contentment, not by getting more, but by discovering how much he had to give. As he walked down the mountain path toward the main road, Teshi looked back once to see Dogen in the temple garden moving peacefully among the flowering trees, completely at home in a life devoted to something larger than himself. Dogen's story shows us something beautiful about human nature that our culture often overlooks. We're taught to believe that happiness comes from getting things for ourselves, from achieving fame, from getting more of what we want. But deep down, most of us sense that real fulfillment comes from the opposite direction, from discovering what we have to offer the world. When we're living for something larger than our personal desires, we're no longer carrying the impossible burden of trying to make ourselves happy through outside things. We're no longer depending on getting specific outcomes to feel worthwhile. Our sense of meaning comes from the giving itself, not from whether we receive thank yous or recognition in return. The Buddha understood this deeply. He spent his life teaching not because he needed to be seen as a great teacher, but because he had discovered something so valuable that keeping it to himself would have been like hiding a lamp under a blanket. His sense of purpose came from the offering, not from the results. When you find this connection, when you discover what you're genuinely called to care for and nurture, you found the foundation of unshakable peace. Not because life stops bringing challenges, but because those challenges become part of your practice rather than threats to your happiness. Your life becomes like Dogen's temple, a place where your inner light burns steadily, offering warmth and guidance to anyone who needs it. And like that mountain in the storm, you remain unmoved by outside problems, because you're rooted in something deeper than personal circumstances. You're rooted in the natural human joy of being useful, of mattering, of making the world a little better through your presence in it. Let your breathing deepen. Now feel yourself settling more completely into rest. Notice how good it feels to simply be here, needing nothing more than this moment of peace. Tomorrow will bring its own opportunities to serve, to give, to be the lamp that lights a small corner of the world. For now, rest in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you have everything you need to live a meaningful life. The capacity to love, to serve, to be present with whatever comes. These gifts are already yours, and no outside event can take them away. In the bustling marketplace of ancient Hangzhou, where merchants sold silk and spices beneath colourful tents, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of haggling voices, a monk named Hinang walked quietly among the stalls. He was a simple man dressed in plain brown robes that had been mended many times. His head was shaved in the traditional way, and he carried only a small cloth bag for the few items he needed. Huang had come to the marketplace not for himself, but to buy rice and vegetables for the small temple where he lived with 12 other monks. The temple was poor, and they depended on donations and careful shopping to make their small funds last. Huang moved slowly through the crowded marketplace, stopping at each stall to examine the goods with gentle care. The morning sun was warm on his shoulders, and he took his time, appreciating the colours and textures of the fresh produce, the skill of the craftsman, the energy of business flowing around him. At one vegetable stand, he picked up several cabbages, feeling their weight, checking each leaf for freshness. The vendor, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, watched him nervously as he examined each cabbage with what seemed like too much care. "Are you going to buy anything, or just handle all my vegetables until they're bruised?" she snapped, her voice sharp with irritation. "I have other customers waiting, and you're taking forever." Huang looked up at her with genuine warmth in his eyes. "Please forgive me for being slow," he said kindly. "These cabbages are beautiful. I would like these 3, please." He placed the best ones carefully in his bag and offered payment with a small bow. The woman took the money without another word, already turning to the next customer. At the rice merchant stall, he took even more time, running the grains through his fingers with the careful attention of someone who understood how precious food could be. He was checking for stones and husks, making sure the rice would cook properly for his community. This merchant, a heavy-set man with sweat beading on his forehead, watched with growing impatience. "What are you, some kind of expert?" he said loudly, drawing attention from other shoppers. "You monks think you're so special, examining everything like you're buying for the emperor himself. If you can't afford good rice, then buy the cheap stuff and stop wasting my time. Other people in the marketplace began to turn and stare. Some whispered among themselves, pointing at the monk who was causing such a commotion. A few looked embarrassed by the merchant's rudeness, but no one spoke up. Huineng continued his careful examination, his expression unchanged, as peaceful as a mountain lake reflecting clouds. He seemed completely unaware that he had become the center of unwanted attention. Finally, a wealthy silk merchant named Jiang Wei, who had been watching this scene unfold with growing irritation, could contain his anger no longer. Jiang Wei was known throughout the marketplace for his expensive clothes, his quick temper, and his sharp tongue. He stomped over to where Huang knelt, examining rice. "You know what your problem is, monk?" Zhang Wei said loud enough for half the marketplace to hear. His face was red with self-righteous anger. "You're arrogant. You think because you shave your head and wear those rags that you're somehow better than the rest of us. But you're just a beggar looking for handouts and pretending to be holy." The marketplace grew quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the vendors paused their selling to watch this confrontation. Everyone within hearing distance expected drama. Some looked excited, hoping for the monk's defense. Others looked uncomfortable, uncertain what would happen next. Huineng finished selecting his rice with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the morning. He paid the merchant, counted out the correct coins slowly and precisely, and carefully placed the bag of rice in his cloth sack. Only then did he turn to face Jiang Wei. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, no need to defend himself. His eyes were as calm as they had been when he first entered the marketplace, like deep pools that reflected everything, but were disturbed by nothing. "Thank you for sharing your thoughts with me," Huang said simply, his voice warm and genuine. "I hope the rest of your day brings you much happiness and prosperity." Jiang Wei was taken aback. He had thrown his hardest punch and hit nothing but air. "Is that all you have to say?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you angry?" "From what should I defend myself?" Huineng asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "You have expressed your opinion about me. That is certainly your right. Your words belong to you, just as my peace belongs to me. But I called you arrogant. I called you a beggar." Jiang Yi stammered, confused by this response he had never encountered before. Huang nodded thoughtfully as if considering this information for the first time. "Yes, I heard what you said. But tell me, honored sir, if someone offers you a gift and you choose not to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" Jiang Wei frowned, confused by the question and frustrated that the conversation had taken this strange turn. "Well, it belongs to the person who offered it, I suppose." "Exactly." "So," Huin said with a warm smile that seemed to include not just Jiang Wei, but the entire crowd that had gathered, "you have offered me the gifts of anger and harsh judgment, but I choose not to accept them. Therefore they remain with you. I hope you will find a better use for them than offering them to strangers." With that, Huineng bowed politely to Jiang Wei, then to the rice merchant, and finally to the small crowd that had gathered. He picked up his bag of provisions and continued peacefully through the marketplace, stopping to make a few more purchases with the same unhurried care he had shown all morning. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of them whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in amazement. Others looked thoughtful, as if something they had always believed had just been quietly overturned. Jiang Yi stood alone in the middle of the marketplace, holding his anger like a burning coal, realizing for the first time in his life that no one had forced him to pick it up. This simple encounter in an ancient marketplace reveals something profound about human freedom that most of us never discover. We spend our lives believing that other people have the power to make us angry, to hurt our feelings, to ruin our day. But this is an illusion that keeps us trapped in emotional reactions. The truth that Huineng demonstrated is this: there is always a space between what happens to us and how we respond. Most people react so quickly that they never notice this space exists. Someone insults them, and anger appears instantly as if it were an automatic response. Someone criticizes them, and hurt feelings seem to arise by themselves as if they had no choice in the matter. But this automatic reaction is just a habit, not a law of nature. In that tiny gap between what happens and our answer is where our freedom lives. When we learn to find that space and rest there, we discover that we are much more powerful than we ever imagined. This starts with simply noticing the gap between event and reaction. The next time someone speaks harshly to you or treats you rudely, try to catch yourself in that moment before you automatically respond. Take one conscious breath. In that breath, you can choose how to respond rather than just reacting from habit. Ask yourself, what is this person really offering me right now? Usually, they're offering you their own emotional state, their stress, their frustration, their judgments, their fears. You can accept these offerings and make them your own, or you can politely decline and let them keep what belongs to them. This isn't about being perfect or never feeling hurt. It's about gradually developing the capacity to choose your emotional responses, rather than having them chosen for you by whoever happens to be having a bad day around you. It's about becoming the author of your own inner experience, rather than letting it be written by random outside events. When you master this art of non-acceptance, you become truly untouchable. Not because you've built walls around your heart, but because you've learned to let other people's emotions pass through you without sticking. Like Huinang in the marketplace, you can move through life with an open heart and a peaceful mind, touched by everything, but disturbed by nothing. In the mountains of northern China, where autumn painted the maple trees brilliant red and gold, stood a small temple called Peaceful Valley. The temple was home to only 5 monks, led by an elderly master named Yunmen, who had been practicing meditation for over 50 years. His face was deeply lined from decades of sitting in contemplation, but his eyes held a lightness that seemed untouched by age. One of the youngest monks in the temple was called Joshu. He was earnest in his practice and worked hard to live up to the standards of temple life. But he struggled with something that made his spiritual progress difficult. He cared deeply about what others thought of him. During meditation, Joshu's mind would often fill with worries about whether he was progressing fast enough, whether the other monks respected him, whether his understanding was deep enough, whether he belonged in this sacred place. These concerns followed him like shadows, coloring every interaction and stealing his peace. Every morning, following ancient tradition, the monks would walk to the nearby village to collect alms. They would move through the streets with their begging bowls, accepting whatever food the villagers could spare. It was a humble practice that kept the temple running while maintaining the connection between the monastery and the community it served. On one particular autumn morning, as Joshu walked through the village with his wooden bowl, the morning air crisp at the promise of winter, he overheard 2 women talking by a stone well. They were washing vegetables for their family's morning meals, their voices carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "Do you see that young monk over there?" one woman said, pointing discreetly in Joshu's direction. She was middle-aged, with greying hair pulled back severely and hands reddened from the cold water. "My cousin, who lives near the temple, told me some interesting things about him." The second woman, younger but with the same sharp expression, looked over at Joshu and nodded with interest. "Oh, what did she say?" "She says he's lazy," the first woman continued, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent Joshu from hearing every word. "Sleeps late, doesn't work as hard as the others, and look how young he is. What could someone that age possibly know about spiritual matters?" Joshu felt his face burning with shame and anger. Every word was completely untrue. He rose before dawn every day for meditation, often sitting longer than anyone else. He worked harder than most in the temple gardens, tending vegetables and maintaining the grounds with meticulous care. He had given up a comfortable life with his family to pursue awakening with complete sincerity. "I agree completely," the second woman replied, scrubbing a radish with unnecessary force. "When I was a girl, Monks were truly holy men who had earned their robes through years of genuine sacrifice. This one probably became a monk just to avoid having to work for a living. Young people today have no dedication. Exactly, the first woman said, warming to her theme. It's a disgrace, really. The temple used to be filled with masters of great wisdom. Now they take anyone who shows up at their gate. Joshu's first impulse was to march over to the women and defend himself, to tell them how wrong they were, to explain his true dedication and the sacrifices he had made. His second impulse was to return immediately to the temple and hide from any further humiliation. Instead, he forced himself to continue his rounds. But the women's words echoed in his mind like painful bells. Each cruel phrase seemed to carve itself deeper into his memory. By the time he returned to Peaceful Valley, his usual calm had completely disappeared. His mind was a storm of defensive arguments, hurt feelings, and angry remarks he wished he had made. Master Yunmen was sitting in the temple garden when Joshu returned, carefully tending to a small pine tree that grew in a large ceramic pot. The old master's movements were slow and deliberate, each gesture an act of meditation. He looked up as Joshu approached, and his experienced eyes immediately saw the young monk's distressed state. "Sit with me," Yunmen said simply, patting the ground beside him. Joshu sat down heavily, his movements sharp with leftover anger. For several minutes they sat in silence while Yunmen continued his work with the small tree, gently adjusting its position to catch the slanted autumn sunlight, carefully removing dead needles with loving attention. "Tell me what has disturbed your peace," Yunmen said finally, his voice as gentle as wind through leaves. Joshu related the entire encounter, repeating the women's words exactly as he had heard them. As he spoke, his anger rekindled, his voice becoming tight with indignation and hurt. "Master, what they said was completely false. I work harder than anyone here. I'm completely sincere in my practice. How dare they judge me without knowing anything about my life or my commitment?" Yunmen nodded thoughtfully and continued working with his tree, trimming a small branch with careful precision. After a long pause, he spoke. "Tell me, Joshu, when you practice archery and shoot an arrow at a target, what do you do if you miss?" Joshu was confused by the question, uncertain how it related to his problem. I examine my aim and try again, Master." "Good. And if someone else shoots an arrow at that same target and also misses, does their failure affect your next shot?" "No, Master. Their arrow has nothing to do with mine." "Exactly," Yunmen said, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "Those women shot arrows of criticism at their idea of who you are, but their arrows missed the target completely because they were aiming at an imaginary person, not the real Joshu." He gently adjusted another small branch on the pine tree. "But you caught their arrows in mid-flight and decided to make them yours. Now you are wounded by arrows that were never meant for you, shot by people who don't even know you exist." Joshu sat quietly, feeling something shift inside his chest, like a tight knot slowly beginning to loosen. "But Master, how do I not take such things personally when they use my name and point directly at me?" Yunmen smiled, setting down his small gardening tools. "The same way this pine tree doesn't take it personally when children throw stones at it. The tree knows what it is. It doesn't need the children's approval to be a tree. It doesn't become less of a tree because of their actions." He looked directly at his student. "Your job is to know yourself so clearly that others' mistaken opinions cannot shake your understanding of who you are. Those women created a fictional character in their minds and gave him your name. Why should you be hurt by criticism of someone who doesn't exist?" This teaching story reveals something crucial about human suffering that we rarely understand clearly. Most of the emotional pain we experience doesn't come from what actually happens to us, but from the stories we tell ourselves about what those events mean. Joshu heard certain sounds, vibrations in the air that we call words. That was the actual event, but his mind immediately created an elaborate story about what these sounds meant. "This proves I'm not good enough. This means I don't belong here. Everyone must think I'm a fraud. This story became the source of his suffering, much more painful than the original experience. This is how the human mind works when it's not trained. It takes neutral events and wraps them in layers of interpretation, meaning, and emotional significance. Someone doesn't return your phone call, and your mind creates a story about rejection. Someone gives you feedback at work, and your mind creates a story about your incompetence. Someone seems distracted when you're talking, and your mind creates a story about your lack of importance. But these stories are just that, stories. They're not facts about reality. They're interpretations created by a mind that is trying to protect you, but often creates more problems than it solves. The freedom that Yunmen taught Joshu is the freedom to distinguish between what actually happens and the stories we tell ourselves about what happens. This distinction is one of the most practical and immediately useful insights you can develop. When you hear criticism, you can ask yourself, what actually happened here? What were the bare facts? Often you'll discover that the actual event was much smaller and less threatening than your interpretation of it. Someone expressed an opinion. Someone revealed their mood or their limitations. Someone showed you their level of understanding. These are just facts, like weather patterns, not personal attacks on your essential worth. Most criticism tells you more about the critic than about the person being criticized. Those women at the well weren't really talking about Joshu. They were expressing their own judgments, their own ideas about how young people should behave, their own nostalgia for an imagined past when everything was better. Their words revealed their mental habits, not objective truth about anyone else. When you understand this, criticism becomes much less personal and much more interesting. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you can ask, "What does this tell me about how this person sees the world?" Instead of defending yourself, you can simply observe the other person's perspective with curiosity, like watching an interesting weather pattern pass through the sky. This doesn't mean dismissing all feedback or becoming arrogant about your own limitations. Useful criticism offered with genuine care and based on accurate observation can be valuable for growth. But you learn to distinguish between feedback that comes from wisdom and love and projection that comes from others' unresolved issues. The practice is to develop such a clear understanding of your own nature that you become like Yunmen's pine tree, rooted in truth rather than in other people's opinions. When you know who you are, what your intentions are, how hard you're trying, what your actual strengths and limitations are, then other people's random judgments can't shake your foundation. This kind of self-knowledge doesn't come from thinking about yourself or analyzing your personality. It comes from the simple practice of honest self-observation without judgment. You learn to see yourself clearly, your genuine efforts and your actual mistakes, your real progress and your remaining blind spots, your authentic motivations, and your ego-driven reactions. When this self-knowledge becomes solid, you develop what we might call emotional immunity. Not because you stop caring about others or become cold to feedback, but because you're no longer dependent on outside validation to know your own worth. You can hear what others say about you without immediately making it about your identity. This creates tremendous inner freedom. You can engage with life fully, take appropriate risks, express yourself authentically, because you're no longer terrified of what others might think or say. You know that their reactions to you reveal their inner landscape, not your actual value as a human being. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, if any harsh words or critical comments from your day arise in your mind, practice seeing them as Yunmen taught Joshu to see them. Someone shot arrows at their idea of who you are, but these arrows never touched your true nature. Your worth is not determined by random opinions from people who don't really know you. Let these arrows fall harmlessly to the ground where they belong, and allow your mind to return to the peaceful awareness that is your true home. Feel your body softening as you release the need to carry other people's judgments with you into sleep. You are like that pine tree rooted in your own nature, unmoved by the stones that children throw. Rest in this understanding and let the deep peace of knowing who you are carry you gently through the night. In the famous Shaolin Temple, nestled in the Song Mountains of central China, there lived a monk who had become famous for his extraordinary garden. Brother Huaiming had spent 20 years transforming a small plot of rocky, barren ground behind the temple's main hall into what many considered a miracle of growing things. The garden was famous throughout the region, not just for its beauty, but for its remarkable productivity. Even in the harshest seasons, when drought withered other gardens or floods washed away careful plantings, Huaiming's plot continued to provide abundant vegetables and herbs for the temple community. Travelers would journey from distant provinces just to see how he achieved such success in such challenging conditions. The garden itself was a marvel of organization and care. Neat rows of vegetables grew in perfect alignment, each plant healthy and vigorous. Fruit trees provided shade and sweet offerings. Herb spirals released their fragrance into the mountain air. Everything seemed to thrive under Huaming's attention, as if the very soil had been blessed. The secret, he would tell anyone who asked, lay not in any special technique or secret fertilizer, but in constant and patient attention to what was allowed to grow and what needed to be removed before it could cause problems. Every morning before dawn, while the other monks were still settling into their meditation hall, Huaiming would walk slowly through his garden with a small oil lamp, its flame flickering gently in the morning breeze. Row by row, plant by plant, he would examine every inch of soil with the careful attention of someone reading a sacred text. When he found young weeds beginning to sprout between his carefully planted vegetables, he would remove them immediately, while their roots were still small and weak. When he discovered insects that might damage his plants, he would gently relocate them to wild areas outside the temple grounds, where they could find food without destroying his crops. When he saw signs of plant disease, he would treat it before it could spread to healthy growth. The key to a productive garden, he would explain to the young monks who came to learn from him, is not to wait until problems become obvious. By then, removing them often damages the good plants around them. The secret is daily attention. Catching difficulties when they are still small and easy to address. One spring, a young monk named Faxiang was assigned to help Huaiming with the garden work. Faxiang was intelligent and eager to learn, but he had grown up in the city and knew nothing about growing things. He was amazed by the amount of time Huaiming spent simply walking through the garden, looking carefully at each plant, seeming to do nothing but observe. "Master Huaiming," Faxiang said one morning, as they worked together in the warming sunshine, "wouldn't it be more efficient to weed the entire garden once a week rather than checking it every single day? It seems like we're doing the same work over and over again." Huaiming smiled and knelt beside a row of young lettuce plants, their tender green leaves just beginning to spread in the rich soil. "Look closely here," he said, pointing to what appeared to be empty earth between the lettuce seedlings. "What do you see?" Faxiang bent down and looked carefully, but saw only dark, rich soil. "I see nothing, master." "Exactly," Huaiming said, taking a small pointed stick and gently scraping away a thin layer of earth. There, barely visible to the untrained eye, were tiny green shoots just beginning to emerge from the soil. "These are dandelion seeds that blew in yesterday on the evening wind. Tomorrow you would see them clearly. In a week, they would be difficult to remove without disturbing the lettuce roots. In a month, they would completely take over this row." He carefully extracted each tiny weed with the tip of his stick, his movements precise and gentle. "The mind is exactly like this garden, young brother. Negative thoughts are like weed seeds constantly blowing in from the outside world through our conversations, our reading, our interactions with others. If we wait until these thoughts are fully grown before we deal with them, they become much harder to remove. And the process often disturbs our inner peace." Faxiang was beginning to understand, but Huaiming continued his lesson as they moved to the next row. "Every day, people will say things that could plant seeds of anger in your mind. You will hear gossip that could grow into harsh judgment of others. You will encounter situations that could sprout into worry or fear about the future. The practice is to catch these mental weeds when they first appear, before they can establish themselves and spread. That afternoon, Faxiang had his first opportunity to apply this teaching. While working quietly in the garden, pulling actual weeds from around the tomato plants, he overheard two visiting monks talking in low voices near the garden gate. They were discussing the temple's abbot, and their words were not kind. "The old master is getting soft," one was saying to the other. "Did you see how gently he corrected that young monk who was sleeping during morning meditation? In my old temple, such behavior would have resulted in immediate punishment." "I agree," the second visitor replied. "The discipline here isn't what it used to be. These young monks need a firmer hand, or they'll never develop real commitment to the practice." Immediately, Faxiang felt a small seed of agreement beginning to sprout in his mind. Yes, he thought, perhaps the abbot was too lenient. Perhaps the discipline here wasn't strict enough compared to other places. Perhaps he wasn't being challenged enough in his own practice. Perhaps then he remembered Heiming's morning lesson about mental weeds. This was exactly what the master had described. These critical thoughts about the abbot and the temple were like dandelion seeds, small and almost invisible now, but capable of growing into a forest of dissatisfaction and judgment that would disturb his peace and poison his relationships with the community. Gently, like removing a tiny weed before it could establish roots, Faxiang acknowledged the critical thoughts without feeding them with more thinking. He neither fought against them nor thought more about them. He simply noticed them arising and chose not to water them with his attention. Returning his focus instead to the physical work of tending the actual garden. That evening, as they cleaned their tools in the slanted light of sunset, Heiming looked at his young student with quiet approval. "I see you understood today's lesson in more than just gardening," he said quietly. Faxiang nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction he had never experienced before. "The weeds want to grow in both kinds of gardens, don't they, Master?" "Yes," Heim replied, setting his tools carefully in their proper places. "But a skilled gardener learns to tend both with the same patient attention and gentle wisdom." This simple story reveals one of the most practical and immediately useful teachings in all of human wisdom. The understanding that we must actively protect our mental environment from harmful influences. Just as a gardener protects their plants from weeds and pests, most of us go through life completely unconscious of what we're allowing to take root in our minds. We absorb negative thoughts from conversations, media, random interactions, and our own mental habits without realizing that these thoughts will grow and multiply if we don't address them consciously. We wonder why we feel anxious, critical, or dissatisfied, not recognizing that we've been unconsciously cultivating these states through mental laziness. The insight that Him shared with Faxiang is profound. Timing matters enormously when it comes to mental cultivation. When a negative thought first appears, it's like those barely visible dandelion shoots, easy to remove without disturbing our peace. But if we allow these thoughts to grow by feeding them with attention, analysis and elaboration, they become like established weeds with deep roots, much more difficult to uproot without causing inner turmoil. This is why the Buddha emphasized the importance of mindfulness, paying attention to what's happening in the mind moment by moment. Not to judge our thoughts or suppress them forcefully, but to develop the wisdom to recognize which mental states serve our well-being and which ones lead us towards suffering. When someone criticizes you harshly, that's the first arrow, the actual event. But then your mind might begin generating thoughts like, "They're right, I am incompetent," or "How dare they speak to me that way?" or "Everyone probably agrees with them." These secondary thoughts are like weed seeds that can grow into forests of self-doubt, anger, or paranoia if we're not careful. The practice Heim teaches is not about suppressing thoughts or pretending that negative things don't happen. It's about developing the subtle awareness to catch unhelpful thoughts early before they can establish themselves and dominate our inner landscape. When a critical thought about someone arises, we can observe it without immediately accepting it as truth. When worry about the future begins to sprout, we can acknowledge it without feeding it with elaborate scenarios and mental movies. This requires the same kind of gentle daily attention that Him brought to his garden. Throughout the day, we can periodically check in with our mental state. What thoughts are taking root here? What emotions are beginning to establish themselves? Are these mental formations leading toward peace and clarity, or toward agitation and confusion? When we notice harmful thoughts beginning to grow, we can practice what might be called skillful abandoning. This is not violent suppression, which often makes thoughts stronger, but gentle redirection. We acknowledge the thought without judgment, recognize that it doesn't serve our well-being, and calmly return our attention to something more constructive. Just as Heiming would gently relocate harmful insects rather than killing them, we can redirect our mental energy rather than fighting against our own minds. When we catch ourselves rehearsing an argument with someone, we can gently guide our attention back to the present moment. When we notice ourselves building elaborate worry scenarios, we can lovingly return our focus to what we can actually control right now. This practice requires patience and consistency. Just like tending a physical garden, we cannot weed the mind once and expect it to remain clear forever. Mental cultivation is a daily practice, a continuous process of mindful attention to what we allow to flourish in the sacred space of our awareness. The goal is not to achieve a mind completely free of negative thoughts, which would be both impossible and unnecessary. Difficult thoughts and emotions are natural responses to challenging situations. The goal is to develop such clear awareness of our mental processes that harmful thoughts cannot establish themselves and take over our inner landscape. We become like skilled gardeners who can quickly identify and address problems before they spread. This understanding also applies to our consumption of information and our choice of mental diet. Just as a gardener is careful about what seeds enter their garden, we can be mindful about what influences we allow into our mental environment. What do we read, watch, and discuss? How do these inputs affect our inner state? Are we consciously choosing mental nutrition that supports our growth, or unconsciously consuming mental junk food that creates agitation and confusion? When we take responsibility for cultivating our minds with the same care that Him brought to his garden, we create the conditions for natural peace and contentment to flourish. Our inner landscape becomes a source of strength rather than a source of stress. A refuge we can always return to, regardless of what storms may be raging in the external world. High in the mountains of Tibet, where the air was so clear that every breath felt like drinking light, stood a small hermitage called Cloudwalker Monastery. The monastery was built on a narrow ledge carved into the cliff face, its simple stone buildings seeming to float between earth and sky. It was home to only 3 monks, led by an ancient master named Tenzin, whose white beard flowed like a waterfall and whose eyes held the depth of mountain lakes. One of the monks was a middle-aged man named Norbu, who had come to the monastery after a difficult life in the valleys below. Before taking robes, Norbu had been a successful merchant, traveling between villages with pack animals loaded with goods. But he had lost everything through a combination of bad weather, bandit attacks, and the betrayal of a business partner he had trusted like a brother. Even after 2 years of monastic life, Norbu struggled with persistent mental visitors that seemed to arrive uninvited. During meditation, his mind would often drift into memories of his former wealth, anger at the partner who had cheated him, and deep worry about whether he had made the right decision in leaving worldly life behind. These thoughts had become so familiar that he barely noticed them anymore, like background noise that colored his entire experience of monastery life. The patterns were always the same. In the morning, as he tried to settle into meditation, memories of his prosperous past would arise, the fine clothes he once wore, the respect he had commanded in the marketplace, the security of knowing he could provide for his family. These memories brought a bittersweet longing that made his simple monastic life feel small and limited. By afternoon, the memories would shift to anger. He would relive scenes of discovering his partner's betrayal, imagine conversations where he confronted the man more forcefully, rehearse arguments he wished he had made. The anger felt righteous and energizing, but it also left him feeling hollow and disconnected from his spiritual practice. Evenings brought worry and self-doubt. Had he been a fool to trust his partner? Was he being a fool now to think he could find peace in monastic life? Maybe he should return to the world and try to rebuild what he had lost. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this contemplative path. Maybe he was just running away from his failures rather than facing them courageously. These mental patterns had become so habitual that Norbu rarely questioned them. They felt like natural responses to his circumstances, automatic features of his inner landscape that he had no choice but to endure. One afternoon, while Noru was sweeping the monastery's small courtyard and lost in particularly painful memories about his business failure, Master Tenzin approached and sat quietly on a simple wooden bench nearby. The old master often did this, simply sitting in companionable silence while the monks went about their daily work, his presence both unobtrusive and deeply calming. After several minutes of shared silence, with only the sound of Norbu's broom against stone and the distant cry of mountain eagles, Tenzin spoke in his soft, clear voice. "Tell me, brother Norbu, what do you see when you look up at that sky?" Noru paused in his sweeping and looked up. Above them stretched a vast expanse of brilliant blue, dotted with white clouds that drifted slowly across the mountain peaks like sailing ships on an azure sea. "I see clouds, master. Many beautiful clouds against the blue sky. How many clouds can you count?" Noru looked more carefully, shading his eyes against the bright mountain sun. "Perhaps 15 or 20, master. They seem to change even as I watch them. And tell me which of those clouds were there yesterday at this same time." Norbu thought for a moment, trying to remember. I don't recall exactly, master. The clouds are always changing, always moving to new places." "Yes," Tenzin said with a gentle smile that seemed to include the entire sky in its warmth. "The clouds are always in motion, always different. Each one arises, takes shape, and dissolves back into empty space. But what about the sky itself? Does the sky change?" Noru looked up again, this time paying attention to the vast blue expanse that held all the clouds. "The sky remains the same, master. It's always present, always open, always peaceful." "Exactly. So," Tenzin said, rising slowly from the bench. "Now tell me, when you sit in meditation, what do you observe in your mind?" "I see many thoughts, master. Memories of my past life, feelings of anger and regret, worries about the future. Sometimes it feels like my entire mind is filled with these experiences. And are these the same thoughts you had yesterday? The same memories and worries?" Norbu considered this carefully. He had never really paid attention to this aspect of his mental experience. "No, master. The specific thoughts change, though they often have similar themes. Sometimes I remember different events. Sometimes the worries focus on different possibilities." "Like clouds in the sky," Tenzin said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had observed these patterns for decades. "Always changing, always moving, sometimes dense and stormy, sometimes light and wispy. But tell me, what is it that observes these thoughts? What is aware of the memories and worries as they pass through your mind?" This question stopped Noru completely. In all his years of struggling with difficult thoughts, he had never considered what was doing the observing. He had been so focused on the content of his thoughts that he had never noticed the awareness that was perceiving them. I'm not sure, master. I never thought about this before." "Look carefully now," Tenzin said, his voice becoming even softer, as if he were sharing a precious secret. "Right now, you are aware of my words. You are aware of the feeling of the broom handle in your hands. You are aware of thoughts arising and passing away in your mind. What is this awareness itself like? Does it come and go like the thoughts do? Does it change like the clouds?" Noru stood very still, turning his attention inward for the first time in a completely new way. Instead of focusing on the content of his thoughts, he tried to notice the awareness that was perceiving them, Gradually, he began to sense something vast and unchanging, like the blue sky that held all the passing clouds. The awareness, it seems, always present master. It doesn't seem to be disturbed by the thoughts that pass through it, even the painful ones. Yes, Tenzin said with deep satisfaction, his eyes sparkling with joy at his student's recognition. The thoughts and emotions are like clouds, temporary formations that arise and dissolve in the space of awareness. But you are not the clouds. You are the sky itself, vast and peaceful, untouched by whatever weather patterns may pass through. He gestured toward the mountain peaks around them, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the afternoon sun. When storm clouds gather around these mountains, do the clouds damage the peaks? When strong winds blow the clouds away, do the mountains try to hold on to them? No, Master. The mountains simply allow the weather to come and go naturally. Your true nature is like those mountains, like that sky. Brother Norbu, your thoughts about the past, your anger at your former partner, your worries about the future, they are all just weather patterns passing through the vast space of your awareness. They cannot damage who you truly are unless you mistake yourself for the passing weather rather than the eternal sky. That evening, during the monastery's evening meditation, Noru practiced this new way of relating to his mental experience. When familiar memories of his business life arose instead of getting caught up in the story, he practiced observing them as temporary clouds passing through the sky of awareness. When anger toward his former partner surfaced, he watched it like weather, noting its arising and its inevitable passing away. For the first time in years, Noru experienced periods of profound peace during meditation. Not because his thoughts stopped arising, but because he stopped identifying with them completely. He was the sky, vast and unchanging, simply allowing all experiences to pass through without resistance or attachment. This profound story points to perhaps the deepest insight in all of human wisdom. The recognition that we are not our thoughts and emotions, but the awareness in which they arise and pass away. Most of us live with the unconscious idea that we are the voice in our head, the stream of thoughts and mental commentary that provides continuous narration about our experience. We identify so completely with this mental activity that we forget there is something deeper, something that remains constant while all these mental formations come and go. This deeper identity is like Tenzin's sky, vast, open and undisturbed by whatever appears within it. When we recognize this difference between the content of consciousness and consciousness itself, it becomes one of the most liberating realizations possible. When Noru was caught in his painful memories and regrets, he was completely identified with the content of his thoughts. He believed that his memories were happening to him now in the present moment, causing fresh suffering each time they arose. But memories are not present moment experiences. They are mental formations like clouds that appear in the sky of awareness and then dissolve. This understanding reveals what true letting go actually means. It's not about suppressing thoughts or emotions, but about changing our relationship to them. When we recognize that we are the sky rather than the clouds, we can allow difficult experiences to arise without being overwhelmed by them. We can acknowledge pain without adding the extra layer of suffering that comes from resisting the pain or making it into a story about our identity. In practical terms, this means developing the ability to observe our mental activity without immediately believing or acting on every thought that arises. When a thought of worry about the future appears, we can note worrying and recognize it as a temporary mental formation rather than an accurate prediction. When a memory of past hurt surfaces, we can observe remembering without being pulled back into the emotional state associated with that memory. This practice is simple, but not always easy. It requires patience and gentle persistence. Throughout the day, when you notice yourself caught up in stressful thoughts, you can pause and ask, who is aware of this stress? What is observing these worried thoughts? This question naturally shifts your identity from the content of your experience to the awareness that perceives it. The key insight is that thoughts and emotions are temporary phenomena. They arise due to causes and conditions, persist for a time, and then naturally dissolve. But the awareness that perceives them is constant and unchanging. When you learn to rest your sense of identity in this deeper awareness, rather than in the changing contents of mind, you discover an unshakable peace that no outside circumstance can disturb. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to life. The sky doesn't ignore the clouds. It simply doesn't struggle against them. Similarly, when you understand your true nature as awareness itself, you can engage fully with life's experiences without being tossed about by every mental and emotional wind. The practice is to regularly remember this deeper identity throughout your day. When you notice yourself lost in mental stories about the past or future, you can gently return to present moment awareness. When you find yourself struggling against difficult emotions, you can remember that you are the vast space in which these emotions are arising, not the emotions themselves. This recognition gradually transforms how you relate to all challenging experiences. Anxiety becomes simply another weather pattern in the sky of awareness. Anger arises and passes away like a summer storm. Sadness moves through like morning mist, leaving the sky clear and bright. This understanding is not a philosophy to believe in, but a direct experience to discover for yourself. Right now, as you listen to these words, notice that something is aware of the listening. Notice that something observes your thoughts about what you're hearing. That aware presence is your true nature. Always available, always peaceful, always home. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can practice settling into this sky-like awareness. Notice any thoughts or concerns from the day that may still be active in your mind. Instead of engaging with their content, practice observing them as temporary formations in the vast space of consciousness. Let them come and go like clouds while you remain as the unchanging sky that holds them all. Your essential nature is this pure awareness, vast and peaceful, untouched by any experience that passes through it. Rest in this understanding and let the natural peace of your deepest being carry you gently into sleep. You are not the storm clouds of thought and emotion. You are the vast open sky in which they briefly appear and disappear, leaving no trace behind. In the high mountains of ancient Tibet, where the wind carried the scent of snow even in summer, and eagles soared between peaks that seemed to touch the heavens, there was a cave temple called Fearless Peak. The temple was carved directly into the cliff face, its rooms connected by narrow stone pathways that hung suspended over vast drops into the valley below. One autumn, a young monk named Pema arrived at Fearless Peak, seeking to deepen his meditation practice under the guidance of the monastery's renowned master, Lama Thubten. Pema was intelligent and deeply sincere about his spiritual development, but he carried within him a burden that made his progress difficult. He was profoundly afraid of being alone. This fear had shadowed Pema since childhood. Whenever he found himself in solitude, especially in quiet or dark places, his mind would fill with anxious thoughts and his body would tense with a nameless dread that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. During group meditations, he felt peaceful and focused, drawing strength from the presence of others. But when he tried to practice alone in his small stone cell, fear would overwhelm him, making concentration impossible. At Fearless Peak, the traditional practice was for each monk to spend one night each month in solitary retreat in what was called the Silence Cave, a small chamber deeper in the mountain where practitioners could experience complete stillness and isolation. For most monks, this was a cherished opportunity for profound inner work. For Pema, the very thought of it created overwhelming anxiety. For his first 3 months at the monastery, Pema found creative excuses to avoid his solitary retreat. He would volunteer for kitchen duty when his turn approached, claiming that the community's needs were more important than his personal practice. He would develop convenient illnesses that required him to stay near the infirmary. He would offer to take the place of other monks who had monastery business to attend to during their retreat times. Master Thubten observed Pema's pattern with the patient wisdom of someone who had guided many struggling students through their deepest fears. The old Lama's face was deeply lined from decades of mountain weather and spiritual practice, but his eyes held a warmth that seemed capable of melting even the most frozen heart. Finally, on a morning when frost painted the mountain peak silver, and the air was so clear it seemed to ring like a bell, Thubten called Pema to his simple chambers. They sat together drinking butter tea beside a small brazier that glowed with steady warmth. The only sound the soft crackling of dried yak dung burning in the metal bowl. "My young friend," Thubin said, as he poured tea into Pema's wooden cup, his movements slow and deliberate. "I notice you have not yet taken your solitary retreat. Are you perhaps waiting for a more auspicious time?" Pema's face flushed with shame. He had hoped his avoidance had gone unnoticed, but he should have known that nothing escaped the master's gentle attention. "Lama Thubten, I find it very difficult to be alone. When I am by myself, especially in silent places, I become extremely afraid. I don't understand why, but the fear is so overwhelming that I cannot meditate at all." Thubten nodded with deep understanding, his eyes reflecting no judgment, only compassion. Fear is like a faithful dog, isn't it? It follows us everywhere, trying to protect us from dangers, both real and imaginary. Tell me, what exactly are you afraid will happen when you are alone in the cave? Pema thought carefully, trying to put his terror into words. "I'm not sure, Master. It's not that I think some specific danger will harm me. It's more like there's something dark waiting in the silence that I don't want to meet. Something about myself, perhaps, that I've been running from." "Ah," Thubten said, his eyes crinkling with recognition and what might have been relief. "You are afraid of meeting yourself completely. This is actually very common, and in truth it shows wisdom. The mind instinctively knows that in deep silence we must eventually face everything we have been avoiding." He sat down his teacup and looked directly at PMA with infinite kindness. "Tonight you will spend the night in Silence Cave, but you will not go alone." Pema felt a wave of relief wash through him. "You will come with me, Master." "No," Thubten replied gently, his smile warm as sunlight. "You will go with your fear. Instead of trying to avoid it or overcome it, you will invite it to be your companion for the night. You will make friends with this faithful dog that has been trying so hard to protect you." That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains like a soft blanket studded with stars, Pema made his way along the narrow stone path to Silence Cave. His hands were trembling as he lit the small oil lamp and settled onto the meditation cushion in the center of the chamber. The cave was completely silent, except for the faint whisper of his own breathing and the almost inaudible flicker of the lamp's flame. Almost immediately, the familiar fear began to rise like water filling a vessel. His heart started beating faster. His breath became shallow and quick. The shadows cast by the lamp seemed to move and dance in threatening ways, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee back to the safety and companionship of the main temple. But then he remembered Master Thubten's unusual instructions. Instead of fighting the fear or trying to push it away, Pema spoke to it quietly, as if addressing an old friend who had come to visit. "Hello, fear," he whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible above his own heartbeat. "I know you're trying to protect me, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you for caring about my safety all these years, but I'm going to sit here tonight and I'd like you to sit with me." The fear seemed surprised by this approach. Instead of the usual struggle and resistance it encountered, it found acceptance and even gratitude. Gradually, Pema began to sense the fear differently. It was like a small frightened child who had been trying to get his attention through the only method it knew, creating anxiety and panic in an attempt to keep him safe from some ancient half-remembered danger. As the night deepened and the oil in his lamp slowly burned lower, Pema continued his gentle dialogue with the fear. He acknowledged its presence without judgment. He thanked it for its years of vigilant service. He assured it that he was safe here in this sacred space, that there was nothing in the silence that could truly harm him. "I understand now," he he said softly to the fear as the flame flickered in the lamp's bronze reservoir. You've been trying to protect me from feeling alone and abandoned, haven't you? You learned long ago that being alone meant being unsafe, and you've been trying to save me from that ever since. Slowly, remarkably, the fear began to soften. Instead of the sharp electric terror he had always known, Pema felt something more like sadness, a deep loneliness that had been hiding behind the anxiety for as long as he could remember. As he allowed himself to feel this loneliness fully without trying to escape from it or fix it, something unexpected happened. In the very center of the loneliness, he discovered something else, a vast, warm presence that had been there all along, waiting patiently behind his fear. It was as if his terror of being alone had prevented him from discovering that he was never actually alone at all. There was always this deeper presence, this unchanging awareness that accompanied him everywhere, more intimate than his own breath. When the lamp finally flickered out near dawn, Pema sat in complete darkness and complete peace, no longer afraid of the silence or the solitude. He had met his fear with such complete acceptance that it had transformed into its opposite, a profound recognition of the constant companionship of his own deepest nature. This beautiful story reveals something profound about the nature of fear and how we can transform our relationship with it. Most of us treat fear as an enemy to be conquered or a weakness to be hidden. But Pema's experience shows us a different way. Fear is a teacher that has something important to show us about ourselves. Fear often develops as a protective mechanism. Usually in childhood, when our young minds create strategies to keep us safe from real or perceived dangers. A child who feels abandoned might develop a fear of being alone. A child who is criticized harshly might develop a fear of making mistakes. A child who witnesses conflict might develop a fear of expressing their own needs. These protective strategies serve their purpose for a time, but they often outlive their usefulness. What once kept us safe as children can become a prison that limits our freedom as adults. The mind that learned to fear being alone continues to create anxiety around solitude long after we're capable of taking care of ourselves. The mind that learned to fear failure continues to prevent us from taking necessary risks long after we've developed the resilience to handle setbacks. The key insight in Pema's story is that fighting against fear often makes it stronger, while approaching it with curiosity and compassion can transform it completely. When we resist fear, we're essentially telling it that it's dangerous, which confirms its message that something is wrong. But when we welcome fear, as Pema learned to do, we discover that it's usually trying to protect us from something that's no longer actually threatening. This approach requires tremendous courage, but it's a different kind of courage than we usually imagine. It's not the courage to be fearless, but the courage to be present with fear. It's not the courage to conquer our emotions, but the courage to meet them with understanding. When you feel afraid, you can try Pema's approach. Instead of immediately trying to get rid of the fear or talk yourself out of it, you can acknowledge it directly. Hello, fear. I notice you're here. What are you trying to protect me from? Often just this simple recognition begins to shift something. Fear loses much of its power when it's met with awareness rather than resistance. You might discover, as Pema did, that your fear is guarding something precious. Maybe your fear of rejection is protecting your deep desire to be loved. Maybe your fear of failure is protecting your longing to contribute something meaningful. Maybe your fear of being alone is protecting your need for connection and belonging. When you see fear this way, it becomes possible to appreciate its positive intention, while gently questioning whether its protective strategy is still necessary. You can thank your fear for trying to keep you safe, while reassuring it that you're now capable of handling the situation it's worried about. This same approach works with shame, fear's close cousin. Shame is often fear's way of trying to prevent us from being rejected by others. It whispers that we're not good enough, smart enough, worthy enough, hoping that by keeping us small and hidden, it can protect us from the pain of criticism or abandonment. But shame, like fear, often outlives its usefulness. The child who learned that being seen was dangerous grows into an adult who hides their gifts from the world. The child who learned that making mistakes brought harsh punishment becomes an adult who never tries anything challenging. The antidote to shame is the same as the antidote to fear: gentle awareness and self-compassion. Instead of fighting against shameful feelings or trying to convince yourself they're wrong, you can acknowledge them with kindness. I notice shame arising. This part of me is trying to protect me from rejection. Thank you for caring about my well-being. When shame is met with this kind of understanding acceptance, it often reveals what it's really protecting: your tender heart, your deep desire to belong, your longing to be seen and appreciated for who you truly are. These are beautiful human needs that deserve compassion, not judgment. Both fear and shame lose their grip on us when we stop seeing them as enemies and start seeing them as messengers. They're usually pointing towards something important: a wound that needs healing, a need that requires attention, or a part of ourselves that has been exiled and wants to come home. The practice is to approach these difficult emotions the way Pema learned to approach his fear, with curiosity, kindness, and patience. Not trying to fix them or get rid of them, but creating space for them to be present and to share what they have to teach us. This kind of inner work takes time and gentleness. You can't force emotional healing any more than you can force a flower to bloom by pulling on its petals. But you can create the conditions for transformation by offering your own difficult emotions, the same compassion you would offer a frightened child. In a small village at the foot of Mount Fuji, where cherry trees lined the streets and the sound of temple bells drifted through the morning air, there lived a potter whose workshop had been passed down through 5 generations of his family. The potter's name was Kenji, and he was known throughout the region for creating vessels of extraordinary beauty and perfect craftsmanship. Kenji had learned his art from his father, who had learned from his father before him in an unbroken lineage of masters stretching back over 2 centuries. Every technique, every secret of the clay and the fire had been carefully preserved and transmitted. The family's reputation was built on creating flawless works that were treasured by tea masters and collectors throughout Japan. This legacy was both Kenji's greatest pride and his heaviest burden. From childhood, he had been taught that anything less than perfection was failure, that a single flaw could destroy the honor of generations of master craftsmen. He worked with meticulous care, discarding countless pieces that contained even the smallest imperfection. One day, a young man named Hiroshi came to Kenji's workshop, asking to become an apprentice. Hiroshi was the son of a farmer with rough hands and no experience with clay, but his eyes held a deep love for beautiful things and a sincere desire to learn. Kenji agreed to teach him, though he wondered if someone from such humble beginnings could ever master the refined art his family had perfected. Hiroshi threw himself into learning with wholehearted enthusiasm. He arrived at the workshop before dawn and stayed until well after sunset, practicing the basic movements again and again. His early attempts were clumsy and crude, but he approached each failure with good humor and determination. As months passed, Hiroshi's skill improved steadily. His vessels became more elegant, his glazes more sophisticated. But he had one persistent problem. No matter how careful he was, many of his pieces developed small cracks during the firing process. Some cracked while cooling in the kiln. Others developed hairline fractures days or weeks later. Each time Hiroshi discovered a crack in one of his pieces, he would bring it to Kenji with deep shame, apologizing profusely for his failure and begging to understand what he was doing wrong. Kenji would examine the piece, point out the technical flaws that had led to the crack, and then watch as Hiroshi smashed the vessel against the stone floor of the workshop, his face dark with self-reproach. "A true craftsman creates only perfect pieces," Hiroshi would say as he swept up the shards. "These failures dishonor the tradition you've shared with me." This pattern continued for over a year. Hiroshi's uncracked pieces became increasingly beautiful. But his shame over the flawed ones grew deeper. He began to see each crack as evidence of his fundamental unworthiness. proof that he would never measure up to the standards of the masters who had come before him. One morning, Kenji arrived at his workshop to find Hiroshi sitting on the floor, surrounded by the broken shards of what had clearly been his finest work yet. The pieces showed remarkable skill and artistic vision, but a single crack had run down one side of the main vessel. Hiroshi's eyes were red with tears of frustration and disappointment. "I can't do this anymore, Master," Hiroshi said without looking up. "I've been trying for more than a year, and I still can't create a perfect piece. Maybe I'm just not meant to be a potter. Maybe I should return to farming, where my failures won't dishonor an ancient tradition." Kenji looked at the beautiful shards scattered across his workshop floor, then at his despairing student. Something in the young man's genuine anguish touched a place in Kenji's heart that had been closed for many years. Without saying a word, he walked to a special cabinet that Hiroshi had never seen opened. From the cabinet, Kenji removed a tea bowl, unlike anything Hiroshi had ever seen. It was clearly very old, its surface marked by a network of fine golden lines that caught the morning light like captured sunbeams. The entire piece seemed to glow with warmth and character. "This bowl," Kenji said softly, "was made by my great-great-grandfather, the founder of our family tradition. It is our most treasured possession, worth more than everything else in this workshop combined." Hiroshi looked at the bowl in amazement, but also confusion. "Master, forgive me, but it's covered in cracks." "Yes," Kenji said, his voice filled with a gentleness Hiroshi had never heard before. "This bowl was broken completely during an earthquake when my great-great-grandfather was still alive. Instead of throwing it away, he mended it using a technique called kintsugi, filling the cracks with lacquer mixed with powdered gold." He held the bowl up to catch the light streaming through the workshop window. "Look closely, Hiroshi. The cracks are not flaws to be hidden. They have become the most beautiful part of the piece. They tell the story of the bowl's journey, its resilience, its ability to be broken and made whole again." Hiroshi stared at the golden veins running through the ceramic, beginning to understand something that would change his entire relationship with his craft and with himself. "My great-great-grandfather taught that our cracks do not make us less than we were before," Kenji continued. "They make us more beautiful, more valuable, more worthy of admiration. A perfect bowl that has never been tested, never been broken, never been mended, tells no story. But a bowl that has been shattered and lovingly repaired tells the story of resilience, of love, of the beauty that comes from accepting our imperfections." With infinite care, Kenji gathered the pieces of Hiroshi's broken vessel from the workshop floor. "Would you like to learn kintsugi?" he asked. "Would you like to learn how to make this piece more beautiful than it ever was when it was perfect?" Through tears of relief and recognition, Hiroshi nodded. As they worked together to mend the broken pottery with threads of gold, both master and student discovered something profound about the nature of true beauty and the healing power of embracing our flaws rather than hiding them. This story reveals something beautiful about shame and how we can transform our relationship with our perceived failures and imperfections. Most of us are taught, like Hiroshi, that our worth depends on being flawless, that any crack in our performance or character makes us less valuable, less lovable, less worthy of respect. But the art of kintsugi teaches us something radically different. Our breaks and cracks, our failures and imperfections can become the most beautiful and valuable parts of who we are. When we learn to honor our wounds rather than hide them, when we find ways to mend ourselves with golden care rather than throwing ourselves away, we discover a beauty that untested perfection could never achieve. Shame tells us that our flaws make us fundamentally defective, that we must hide our struggles and failures to be worthy of love and acceptance. It whispers that everyone else has figured out how to be perfect while we alone are broken. But this is one of shame's cruelest lies. Every human being has cracks, has been broken in some way, has areas where they feel inadequate or wounded. The difference between those who suffer under shame and those who have learned to transform it lies not in the presence or absence of flaws, but in how we relate to our imperfections. When we try to hide our cracks, they remain sources of pain and vulnerability. But when we learn to acknowledge them with the same kind of loving attention that the potter brought to mending broken pottery, they can become sources of wisdom, compassion, and authentic beauty. This doesn't mean celebrating our mistakes or refusing to grow and improve. It means recognizing that our struggles and failures are not evidence of our unworthiness, but proof of our courage to try, to risk, to be vulnerable in a world that often feels unsafe. The golden lines in kintsugi pottery represent something profound about healing. They don't try to make the cracks invisible or pretend the breaking never happened. Instead, they honor the history of the piece, acknowledging that this bowl has a story, has been tested by life, has survived something difficult, and emerged more beautiful because of it. In your own life, you can practice this art of golden repair with your emotional wounds and perceived failures. Instead of trying to hide the places where you've been broken, you can learn to see them as part of your unique beauty. The divorce that taught you about resilience, the job loss that forced you to discover hidden strengths, the betrayal that deepened your capacity for compassion, the failure that humbled your ego and opened your heart. This doesn't mean romanticizing suffering or seeking out painful experiences. It means learning to extract wisdom and beauty from the difficulties that inevitably come to every human life. It means refusing to throw yourself away because you've been cracked, choosing instead to mend yourself with golden threads of self-compassion and understanding. When shame arises about your perceived inadequacies, you can remember the lesson of kintsugi. Your flaws are not defects that make you worthless. They're evidence that you've lived, that you've been willing to risk failure in pursuit of something meaningful. They're part of your story, part of what makes you uniquely beautiful. The practice is to approach your own imperfections with the same loving attention that a master craftsman brings to mending precious pottery. Not rushing to fix everything or pretending nothing is broken, but taking time to honor what has been damaged and find ways to repair it that create new forms of beauty. This might mean seeking therapy to heal old wounds, talking honestly with friends about your struggles, or simply treating yourself with the kindness you would offer a dear friend who was going through difficulties. It means learning to see your scars not as signs of weakness, but as evidence of your strength, your willingness to heal, your capacity to transform pain into wisdom. When you learn to practice this golden repair on yourself, you naturally become more compassionate toward others. You begin to see that everyone is walking around with their own invisible cracks, their own hidden struggles, their own need for gentle mending. This recognition dissolves the isolation that shame creates and connects you to the shared human experience of being beautifully, imperfectly whole. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can bring this spirit of golden repair to any areas of shame or self-criticism that may be active in your mind. Instead of trying to fix these feelings or judge yourself for having them, you can offer them the same gentle attention you would bring to mending something precious that had been broken. Your imperfections are not obstacles to your worth. They're part of what makes you irreplaceably valuable. Like the golden lines in Japanese pottery, they tell the story of a life fully lived, fully risked, fully loved. Rest in this understanding and let the gentle art of self-compassion fill any cracks in your heart with threads of pure gold. In a quiet temple nestled in the hills outside Kyoto, where bamboo groves swayed gently in the evening breeze and the sound of a small stream provided constant peaceful music, there lived a monk whose contemplative life was about to be dramatically disrupted. Brother Jishin had spent 3 years at Tranquil Waters Temple, developing a deep meditation practice and finding profound peace in the predictable rhythms of monastic life. He rose before dawn for sitting practice, worked quietly in the temple gardens during the day, and spent his evenings in study and reflection. His cell was simple but perfectly arranged, his mind clear and calm, his heart filled with contentment. The source of his disruption arrived on a humid summer morning in the form of his new neighbor, The house next to the temple had been empty for months, but now it had been purchased by a man named Tanaka, who seemed to possess no understanding whatsoever of the peaceful atmosphere that the monks worked so hard to maintain. Tanaka was a merchant who dealt in metal goods, and he had decided to set up a workshop behind his house where he could craft his wares. From early morning until late evening, the sound of hammering, sawing, and metal grinding shattered the tranquil silence that Gishin had come to cherish. But the noise was only the beginning. Tanaka had a loud voice that he used liberally, calling out to his workers, haggling with customers, and engaging in boisterous conversations that carried clearly across the temple grounds. He seemed to conduct his business as if the entire neighborhood were his workshop, with no consideration for others who might value quiet. Worse still, Tanaka appeared to take particular delight in starting his loudest work precisely during the temple's meditation times. The morning sitting period, which had always been Gishin's most peaceful hour, became an exercise in enduring the rhythmic pounding of metal on metal. The evening contemplation, once a time of deep reflection, was now punctuated by the grating sound of saws cutting through wood and iron. Within a week, Jean's carefully cultivated peace had evaporated. During meditation, instead of attending to his breath, he found himself listening for the next disruption, his jaw clenched with anticipation of more noise. When silence did occur, he couldn't relax into it because he knew it was only temporary. His frustration grew daily. He began to have elaborate fantasies about confronting Tanaka, imagining speeches about respect and consideration for others. He plotted ways to complain to local authorities about noise violations. He even considered requesting a transfer to another temple, despite his deep love for tranquil waters. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night filled with late evening hammering, Jishin went to see the temple's abbot, Master Echo. Echo was an elderly monk, with eyes that seemed to hold both infinite patience and subtle humor. Someone who had guided the temple community through many challenges over the decades. "Master," Jishin said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful, "I need to speak with you about our neighbor. His noise-making is destroying the peaceful atmosphere of our temple. Surely, we must do something to protect our practice environment." Master Echo listened quietly as Jishin described his struggle with Tanaka's disruptions, his attempts to meditate through the noise, his growing anger and frustration. When Jishin finished his complaint, the master sat in silence for several long minutes, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Brother Jishin," Echo said finally, "what do you think this man is here to teach you?" Jishin was taken aback by the question. "Teach me, Master. He's not teaching anything. He's preventing me from learning by destroying our quiet environment." "Really?" Echo asked, his eyes twinkling with gentle amusement. "You have been practicing meditation for 3 years in perfect silence. You have developed the ability to concentrate when conditions are ideal. But what happens when conditions are not ideal? What happens when life does not cooperate with your preferences?" Jishin felt something shift inside him, a small crack in his certainty about who was right and who was wrong in this situation. "This merchant," Echo continued, "has appeared at exactly the right time to show you where your practice is still incomplete. Any student can find peace in a perfectly quiet environment. But can you find peace when life is noisy, chaotic, and uncooperative? Can you remain calm when others don't behave as you think they should?" The master gestured toward the window, where the faint sound of Tanaka's morning work was already beginning. "Your neighbor is offering you advanced training in patience, acceptance, and non-attachment. He is showing you that true peace cannot depend on external conditions. If your calmness can be destroyed by the sound of hammering, how deep is it really?" Jishin sat in silence, realizing that he had been seeing his situation completely backwards. He had been viewing Tanaka as an obstacle to his spiritual development, when he was actually being offered an extraordinary opportunity for growth. "But Master, how do I practice with such constant disturbance?" "The same way you practiced with constant silence," Echo replied. "You sit, you breathe, you observe whatever arises, whether it's the sound of a bell or the sound of a hammer. The practice is not to control your environment, but to maintain awareness regardless of what your environment contains. That evening, Jishin approached his meditation with completely new understanding. When Tanaka's hammering began, instead of tensing against it, Jishin included it in his awareness. Instead of seeing it as disruption, he experienced it as part of the rich texture of life unfolding around him. Instead of fighting for quiet, he found a deeper quiet that could hold all sounds without being disturbed by them. Over the following months, Jishin's practice deepened in ways he had never imagined possible. He learned to meditate in conditions that would have been impossible before. More importantly, he developed the kind of inner stability that remained unshaken regardless of outside events. When Tanaka eventually moved his workshop to a different location, Jishin found himself almost missing the challenges his neighbor had provided. The merchant had been, without knowing it, one of the most effective meditation teachers Jishin had ever encountered. Most of us go through life with an unconscious expectation that other people should behave in ways that make our lives easier and more pleasant. When they don't, when they're loud, when we want quiet, busy when we want calm, demanding when we want space, we automatically assume something is wrong and needs to be fixed. But what if these challenging people are actually serving an essential function in our spiritual development? What if they're showing up in our lives precisely because we need to learn something that only they can teach us? Jishin's story shows how a shift in perspective can transform what seems like an obstacle into an opportunity. His neighbor wasn't actually preventing him from practicing meditation. He was providing a different, more challenging form of meditation practice. The noise wasn't destroying the conditions for inner peace. It was revealing how conditional and fragile that peace had been. This principle applies to all kinds of difficult relationships. The colleague who constantly interrupts you might be teaching you about patience and the skill of maintaining your center when others are chaotic. The family member who criticizes you might be showing you where you're still dependent on external approval for your sense of worth. The friend who's always late might be offering you lessons in acceptance and letting go of the need to control others' behavior. When someone triggers a strong emotional reaction in you, that reaction is valuable information. It's pointing toward an area where you're still attached, still dependent on outside circumstances being a certain way for you to feel okay. The person who annoys you is showing you exactly where your inner freedom is limited. When you can see every difficult person as a teacher who has volunteered to play the challenging role in your life's curriculum, something remarkable happens. You stop taking their behavior so personally. You become curious about what you're meant to learn, rather than angry about what you're experiencing. You develop gratitude for the growth opportunities that life provides, even when they come in uncomfortable packages. In the fertile valleys of southern China, where terrace fields climbed hillsides like giant steps and ancient irrigation channels carried mountain water to countless crops, there lived a farmer named Hang Wei, who had inherited both his land and his approach to farming from 4 generations of ancestors. Hangyi's family had always been known for their abundant harvests, but Huang Wei himself was determined to do even better than his forebears. He had read about new farming techniques from distant provinces, studied the timing of planting and harvesting in unprecedented detail, and developed elaborate plans for maximizing the productivity of every inch of his land. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had farmed according to the natural rhythms of the seasons and the subtle signs they read in weather patterns and soil conditions, Hangyi tried to force his will upon the land. He planted crops when his calculations said they should be planted regardless of whether the soil felt ready. He forced irrigation when his schedule demanded it, even if the natural water table was low. He pushed his workers and animals to maintain the pace he had determined was optimal, regardless of their natural energy cycles. For the first few years, Huang Wei's approach seemed successful. His meticulous planning and relentless effort produced good harvests, and he began to think that his scientific approach was superior to the old-fashioned methods his family had always used. But gradually problems began to emerge. Crops that were forced to grow out of their natural timing became more susceptible to diseases. soil that was overworked began to lose its fertility. Workers who were pushed beyond their natural rhythms became exhausted and made more mistakes. Animals that were driven too hard became sick and less productive. The crisis came during Hangi's 5th year of intensive farming. That spring brought unusual weather patterns. Late rains followed by an early drought, then sudden floods that washed away carefully prepared seeds. According to Hangi's detailed plans, this was the year for his most ambitious planting schedule yet. He had invested heavily in seeds and equipment, borrowed money against future harvests, and committed to deliver specific quantities of grain to merchants in the provincial capital. Despite the challenging weather, Hangi determined to stick to his plan. He replanted washed-out fields multiple times, used precious well water to irrigate during the drought, and worked his people and animals from dawn to dusk, trying to make up for lost time. By midsummer, it was clear that the struggle was not working. The repeatedly replanted crops were weak and struggling. The overworked soil was compacted and resistant to both water and root growth. The exhausted workers were making costly errors, and several of his best animals had fallen ill from overwork. Meanwhile, Hangi noticed that his elderly neighbor, old Chen, seemed to be having much better results with far less apparent effort. Chen's fields, which bordered Hangi's property, were green and thriving, while Hangi struggled. Swallowing his pride, Hang Wei approached the old farmer one evening as Chen sat peacefully on his porch, smoking a pipe and watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Honored uncle," Huang Wei said, using the respectful term for an elder. "I have been observing your fields, and I confess I don't understand how you achieve such good results. What techniques are you using? What is your planting schedule?" Old Chen chuckled softly, his weathered face creasing with gentle amusement. "I use the same techniques my grandfather taught me and his grandfather taught him. I plant when the earth is ready, harvest when the crops are ripe, and rest when the land needs rest." "But what about efficiency? What about maximizing productivity?" Hang Wei asked, his voice reflecting his frustration with his own struggles. "Come," Chen said, rising slowly from his chair. "Let me show you something." He led Huang Wei to a small stream that ran between their properties. The water moved smoothly around rocks and fallen logs, finding the easiest path through the landscape. Where the stream was wide and shallow, the water spread out and flowed gently. Where the banks narrowed, it moved more quickly. When it encountered a large boulder, it didn't try to push through, but flowed around, always finding a way forward. "Watch the water," Chen said quietly. "Does it fight against the rocks? Does it struggle to flow uphill? Does it exhaust itself trying to be somewhere other than where it is?" Huangyi watched the stream for several minutes, beginning to understand something he had never considered before. The water accomplishes its goal of reaching the sea not through force, but through constant, patient movement in harmony with the landscape it encounters, Chen continued. "It works with gravity, not against it. It adapts to obstacles instead of fighting them. It finds the natural path rather than insisting on an artificial one." They walked slowly through Chen's fields as the old farmer explained his approach. He planted different crops in different areas based on subtle variations in soil composition and drainage. He rotated his plantings not according to a rigid schedule, but based on what each field seemed to need. He worked with the natural energy cycles of his workers and animals, recognizing that sustainable productivity came from sustainable practices. "This spring's unusual weather was challenging for everyone," Chen said, as they stopped beside a thriving field of rice. "But instead of fighting against it, I asked myself, what is this weather trying to teach me? What opportunities might it be offering?" He pointed to a section of his land that had been flooded early in the season. Instead of immediately replanting it with his original plan, Chen had observed how the water naturally pulled in that area and decided to create a small pond for raising fish. The fish not only provided food and income, but also fertilized the surrounding soil with their waste. "Young farmers often think that success comes from imposing their will upon the land," Chen said as they completed their tour. "But wise farmers learn to dance with the land, to work with its nature rather than against it. The earth is not our enemy to be conquered, but our partner in the dance of growth and harvest. Over the following months, Hangi gradually transformed his approach to farming. Instead of rigid schedules, he learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when crops were ready for each stage of development. Instead of pushing his workers to exhaustion, he discovered that well-rested people were more creative and efficient. Instead of forcing maximum production from every field every year, he implemented rotations that allowed the soil to restore its fertility naturally. The immediate result was less stress and more enjoyment in his daily work. The long-term result was healthier soil, more resilient crops, and ultimately higher productivity, achieved through sustainable methods. Most importantly, Hangi discovered the deep satisfaction that comes from working in harmony with natural forces rather than constantly struggling against them. This story reveals something profound about how we can approach not just farming, but every aspect of our lives. Most of us have been conditioned to believe that success comes from force, from pushing harder, from overcoming resistance through sheer willpower. But nature teaches us a different way, the path of intelligent cooperation with the forces already at work in our lives. Old Chen's stream offers a perfect metaphor for this alternative approach. Water accomplishes its goal of reaching the sea not through struggle, but through persistent movement in harmony with the landscape it encounters. It doesn't waste energy fighting against obstacles, but finds creative ways to flow around them. It doesn't exhaust itself trying to move uphill, but follows the natural pull of gravity. This is what wise teachers mean when they speak of living according to nature or following the natural way. It's not about becoming passive or giving up our goals, but about learning to distinguish between effort that works with life's natural patterns and struggle that works against them. In our personal lives, this might mean recognizing our natural energy rhythms and working with them rather than against them. Some people are naturally more creative in the morning, others in the evening. Some work best in intense bursts followed by periods of rest. Others prefer steady, consistent effort. When we honor these natural patterns instead of forcing ourselves into artificial schedules, we often find we accomplish more with less stress. It also means learning to read the subtle signs that indicate when we're ready for different kinds of growth or change. Just as Chen knew when his fields were ready for planting, we can learn to sense when we're ready for new challenges, when we need rest and restoration, when it's time to let go of something that's no longer serving us. The Buddha's teaching about the middle way points to this same wisdom. It's the path between the extremes of indulging and depriving ourselves, between pushing too hard and not trying at all. It's the sweet spot where effort feels natural rather than forced, where we're moving toward our goals, but not at the expense of our well-being. One of the most practical applications of this teaching is learning to work with our emotions rather than fighting against them. When we're feeling sad, instead of immediately trying to cheer up, we can ask what this sadness might be trying to tell us. When we're feeling afraid, instead of forcing ourselves to be brave, we can explore what this fear is trying to protect. When we're feeling angry, instead of suppressing it or acting it out, we can investigate what boundary might need attention. This doesn't mean wallowing in difficult emotions or using them as excuses for harmful behavior. It means learning to treat our emotional life like Chen treated his farming, with attention, respect, and willingness to work with what's actually happening rather than what we think should be happening. The same principle applies to our relationships with others. Instead of trying to control or change people, we can learn to accept them as they are, while making wise choices about how to respond to their behavior. Instead of forcing relationships to be what we want them to be, we can appreciate what they actually offer while maintaining healthy boundaries. Living according to nature also means accepting the cycles and seasons of life. Just as Chen understood that fields need periods of rest to maintain their fertility, we can learn to honor the times in our lives when we need to step back, reflect, and restore our energy rather than constantly pushing for outside achievement. This might mean taking breaks when we're feeling overwhelmed, saying no to commitments that don't align with our values, or allowing ourselves to grieve losses fully rather than rushing to move on. It means recognizing that sustainable happiness comes from working with our humanity rather than trying to transcend it. The practice is to become more sensitive to the natural flows and rhythms in your own life. Notice when you feel energized and when you feel depleted. Pay attention to which activities feel effortless and which require excessive force. Observe which relationships feel nourishing and which feel draining. This doesn't mean only doing what's easy or avoiding all challenges. It means learning to distinguish between effort that feels aligned with your deepest nature and struggle that comes from fighting against yourself or life's natural patterns. Good effort feels like flowing downstream rather than swimming upstream, like dancing rather than wrestling. On the slopes of Mount Emma, where ancient temples perched on misty peaks and pilgrims climbed stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, there grew a tree that had become famous throughout the region for its remarkable ability to survive in impossible conditions. The tree was an ancient pine over 300 years old that clung to a narrow ledge of rock high on the mountain face. Its roots had somehow found purchase in tiny cracks in the stone, drawing sustenance from minimal soil and rainwater that collected in the crevices. Despite facing fierce winds, ice storms, lightning strikes, and occasional rockfalls, the tree not only survived, but thrived, its branches reaching toward the sky with graceful strength. Pilgrims would often stop to marvel at this tree, wondering how it managed to flourish in such challenging conditions. Many would sit beneath its sparse shade to rest and contemplate the lessons it might offer about resilience and endurance. One summer, a young monk named Dao Ming was making his first pilgrimage to the sacred mountain. Dao Ming was going through a particularly difficult period in his life. He had recently lost his master to illness, felt uncertain about his spiritual progress, and was struggling with doubts about his chosen path. Everything in his life seemed hard, requiring tremendous effort just to maintain basic balance. When Dao Ming reached the famous tree, he was exhausted from the climb and discouraged by his own struggles. He sat beneath its branches and looked up at its strong, flexible limbs, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. "How do you do it?" he asked aloud, feeling somewhat foolish for talking to a tree, but desperate for guidance. "How do you stay strong when everything is against you?" To his surprise, an elderly woodcutter who had been gathering fallen branches nearby overheard his question and approached with a gentle smile. "You're asking the tree how it survives," the old man said, settling down beside Dao Ming on the rocky ledge. "I've been watching this tree for 60 years, and I think I can tell you its secret." The woodcutter's name was Lao Jiang, and he had spent his entire life in these mountains. His weathered hands and keen eyes spoke of decades of observing the natural world with close attention. "Look carefully at how this tree grows," Lao Jiang said, pointing to the pine's unusual shape. "See how its trunk curves and bends. Notice how its branches don't all reach straight up like trees in easier places, but extend in whatever direction they can find light in space." Dao Ming looked more closely and saw that the tree's form was indeed unusual. Instead of growing straight and tall like pines in more favorable conditions, this tree had adapted its entire structure to work with the constraints of its rocky environment. "When this tree was young," Lao Jiang continued, "it could have tried to grow exactly like trees in the valley, reaching straight up toward the sky. But that would have put it in direct conflict with the rock face above. Instead, it learned to grow around obstacles to find creative ways to reach the light." He pointed to where the trunk curved gracefully around a large boulder. "See here. The tree didn't try to push through this rock or grow over it. It simply adjusted its path, turning this obstacle into part of its own unique beauty." Lao Jiang stood and walked to where the tree's roots disappeared into cracks in the stone. "And look at the roots. They don't fight against the rock. They find every tiny opening, every hairline crack, and follow those spaces deeper into the mountain. They work with the stone, not against it." "But how does it stay flexible in such harsh conditions?" Dao asked. "When the storms come, how does it avoid breaking?" "Ah," Lao Jiang said. his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm for his favorite subject. Watch the branches during the next wind gust. As if summoned by his words, a strong mountain breeze swept across the ledge. Dao Ming watched in fascination as the tree's branches swayed and bent dramatically, some nearly touching the rock face before springing back to their original position. Rigid trees break in storms, Lao Jiang explained, but flexible trees dance with the wind. This old pine has learned to bend so far it almost touches the ground, but it never breaks because it doesn't resist the force of the storm. It moves with it. Over the next hour, Lao Jiang shared what 60 years of mountain observation had taught him about the relationship between survival and adaptability. He showed Dao Ming how the tree's needles had grown smaller and thicker than normal pines to conserve water in the dry mountain air, how its bark had developed extra thickness to protect against temperature extremes, how it had learned to make the most of brief growing seasons by storing energy efficiently during favorable periods. This tree teaches us something important about living wisely, Lao Jiang said as they prepared to part ways. Life will always present us with conditions we cannot control. Storms will come. Resources will sometimes be scarce. Obstacles will appear in our path. We cannot change these realities. He placed his hand gently on the pine's curved trunk. But we can learn from this tree's example. We can develop flexibility instead of rigidity. We can find creative ways around obstacles instead of exhausting ourselves trying to break through them. We can put our roots down deep in whatever soil we find ourselves in, rather than constantly wishing we were planted somewhere else. Dao Ming felt something shift in his understanding of his own struggles. He had been approaching his challenges like a tree trying to grow straight up through solid rock, using force and resistance. What if instead he could learn to bend and adapt like this ancient pine? The tree doesn't struggle against the mountain, Lao Jiang continued. It makes the mountain its partner. It finds ways to thrive precisely because of the challenges, not in spite of them. Its unique beauty comes from the very difficulties that would have destroyed a less flexible tree. As Dao Ming continued his pilgrimage that day, he carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to live according to nature, not fighting against his circumstances, but learning to work creatively within them, not resisting the storms of life, but developing the flexibility to bend without breaking, not wishing he was somewhere else, but putting down deep roots in whatever soil he found himself in. Years later, when other young monks came to him with their struggles, Dao Ming would often tell them about the pine tree on Mount Emma and how it taught him that true strength comes not from rigidity, but from the wisdom to adapt, to bend, and to find beauty in the very conditions that seem most challenging. This beautiful story reveals another dimension of living according to nature. The cultivation of adaptive wisdom that allows us to thrive in whatever conditions we encounter, rather than constantly fighting for conditions to be different. The pine tree on Mount Emma demonstrates something profound about resilience. Its strength doesn't come from being hard and unyielding, but from being flexible and creative in response to challenges. Instead of trying to grow like a tree in ideal conditions, it developed its own unique form that worked with the constraints of its environment. This teaches us something important about how to approach our own life circumstances. Most of us spend enormous energy wishing our situation were different, fighting against conditions we cannot control, or trying to force our lives to match some ideal image we have in our minds. But this approach often leads to frustration and exhaustion, like a tree trying to grow straight through solid rock. The alternative that nature teaches is adaptive creativity. When we encounter obstacles, instead of seeing them as problems to be eliminated, we can ask, how can I work with this? What new possibilities might this challenge open up? How can I find a way around this that creates something beautiful and unique? This doesn't mean settling for less or giving up our dreams. The pine tree never stopped reaching toward the light. It just found a creative path to get there. Similarly, we can maintain our deepest aspirations while remaining flexible about how we achieve them. In practical terms, this might mean adapting our career goals when certain doors close, finding new ways to express our creativity when our original plans don't work out, or discovering unexpected forms of love and connection when relationships don't unfold as we expected. The tree's flexibility in storms offers another crucial lesson about emotional resilience. When difficult emotions arise, fear, anger, sadness, disappointment, we often try to resist them or fix them immediately. But the tree teaches us that sometimes the wisest response is to bend with the emotional storm, allowing ourselves to feel deeply without being broken by the experience. This kind of emotional flexibility means neither suppressing our feelings nor being completely overwhelmed by them, but finding the middle path of acknowledging what we're experiencing while maintaining our essential stability. Like the pine's branches that can bend almost to the ground but always spring back, we can allow ourselves to feel deeply while trusting in our fundamental resilience. The story also illustrates the importance of putting down deep roots wherever we find ourselves, rather than constantly waiting for better conditions to begin living fully. The tree didn't waste energy wishing it had been planted in rich valley soil. It made the most of the rocky ledge where it found itself. Many of us postpone happiness or meaningful engagement with life because we're waiting for circumstances to improve. We think we'll be content when we get the right job, the right relationship, the right living situation. But the tree teaches us that we can develop deep roots and find nourishment even in challenging soil. This means learning to appreciate what our current situation offers rather than focusing only on what it lacks. It means finding ways to grow and contribute regardless of outside limitations. It means developing the kind of inner resources that aren't dependent on perfect conditions. The tree's unique beauty, shaped by the very difficulties that would have destroyed a less adaptable tree, points to one of the most profound insights about human growth. Our struggles, limitations, and challenges don't have to be obstacles to our becoming who we're meant to be. They can become the very forces that shape us into something more beautiful and unique than we could have been without them. This perspective transforms how we relate to our problems and difficulties. Instead of seeing them only as things to be eliminated, we can ask, how might this challenge be shaping me in positive ways? What strength is it helping me develop? What unique beauty might emerge from learning to thrive in these particular conditions? The practice is to cultivate what we might call adaptive presence, the ability to respond creatively to whatever life presents, rather than rigidly insisting that life conform to our expectations. This means developing flexibility of mind and heart, finding ways to work with reality rather than against it, and trusting that we can find beauty and meaning even in conditions that are far from ideal. When storms come in your life, whether they're external challenges or internal emotional upheavals, you can remember the lesson of the ancient pine. Bend, but don't break. Adapt, but don't give up your essential nature. Find creative ways around obstacles rather than exhausting yourself trying to break through them. Most importantly, remember that your unique beauty may emerge precisely from the challenges you face, not in spite of them. The conditions you might wish were different could be the very forces that are shaping you into someone more resilient, compassionate, and wise than you could have become in easier circumstances. Tonight, as you settle into rest, you can practice this adaptive presence with whatever you're experiencing right now. Instead of fighting against tiredness, stress, or any difficult emotions that may be present, you can allow yourself to bend with them, trusting in your fundamental resilience and your capacity to find your way to peace. Like the pine tree's roots finding nourishment in tiny cracks in stone, you can find sustenance and stability even in challenging conditions. Rest in this trust and let the natural wisdom of adaptation carry you gently into sleep. In a small temple high in the mountains of Tibet, where the air was so thin that every breath was a conscious act, and the silence so deep it seemed to ring like a bell, there lived a monk whose life was about to be transformed by forces completely beyond his control. Brother Tenzin had spent 15 years at Pemling Temple developing a profound meditation practice and finding deep satisfaction in the simple rhythms of temple life. His days were filled with prayer, study, and contemplation. His small cell contained everything he needed: a sleeping mat, a few robes, his wooden bowl, and several cherished texts that had guided his spiritual development. Tenzin had never been a wealthy man, even before becoming a monk, but the monastery had always provided for his basic needs. There was simple food, adequate shelter, and the precious opportunity to dedicate his life to spiritual practice without worldly concerns. He felt genuinely grateful for this simple abundance and believed he had learned to appreciate life's essential gifts. One autumn morning, everything changed. A devastating earthquake struck the region, lasting only minutes, but leaving destruction that would reshape the landscape forever. When the terrible shaking finally stopped and the dust settled, Tenzin emerged from the ruins to discover that his world had been completely transformed. The monastery's main buildings had collapsed. The library, with its irreplaceable ancient texts, lay buried under tons of stone. The kitchen, the meditation hall, the rooms where the monks had lived for generations, all were reduced to rubble. Most heartbreaking of all, several of the older monks, including Tenzin's beloved teacher, had been killed in the collapse. In a matter of minutes, Tenzin had lost almost everything he held dear: his teacher, his books, his comfortable cell, the predictable routines that had given structure to his life. Even the monastery's food stores were buried under debris, leaving the surviving monks without provisions. As winter approached for the first few days after the earthquake, Tenzin felt overwhelmed by grief and loss. He wandered through the ruins, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had been destroyed. Everything that had given his life meaning seemed to have been swept away in an instant. The future that had once seemed secure now appeared uncertain and frightening. The surviving monks, only 7 of the original 23, gathered each evening to share their meager resources and discuss their situation. Some talked of leaving to find shelter in other monasteries. Others spoke of returning to lay life, unsure how to continue their spiritual practice without the structure and community they had depended upon. On the 4th night after the earthquake, as Tenzin sat alone among the ruins, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than ever before, something unexpected began to shift in his understanding. Perhaps it was the silence, deeper now than it had ever been when the monastery was full of activity. Perhaps it was the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of complete loss. But gradually, Tenzin began to see his situation differently. He realized that he was still alive when he easily might not have been. His body was unharmed while others had been severely injured. His mind, though grieving, was still capable of thought and reflection. The teachings his teacher had given him over the years lived on in his memory and understanding, untouched by the earthquake. As this recognition deepened, Tenzin felt a strange sensation arising in his heart. Despite the devastation around him, despite the uncertainty of his future, he began to feel grateful. Not grateful for the earthquake or the destruction, but grateful for what remained, for what could never be taken away. He was grateful for each breath in the thin mountain air. Grateful for the warmth of the small fire the monks had managed to build from salvaged wood. Grateful for the companionship of his fellow survivors, their shared vulnerability creating a bond deeper than they had known when life was comfortable. Most surprisingly, Tenzin found himself grateful for the earthquake itself, not because he wanted destruction, but because it had stripped away everything non-essential and revealed what truly mattered. Without his books, he discovered how much wisdom lived in his own heart. Without his comfortable cell, he appreciated the vast openness of sleeping under the stars. Without the monastery's routines, he found a more intimate connection to the natural rhythms of day and night. Over the following weeks, as the monks worked together to create temporary shelter and forage for food, Tenzin's gratitude continued to deepen. Every small blessing, a handful of barley found in the ruins, A clear day for gathering firewood, a night without wind felt like an incredible gift. When a supply caravan finally reached them from the valley below, bringing food and materials to help them survive the winter, Tenzin received his portion with such profound appreciation that the merchants were moved to tears. They had never seen anyone express such genuine gratitude for simple necessities. "How can you be so thankful?" one of the merchants asked. "You've lost everything." "No," Tenzin replied with a smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "I've lost many things, but I've discovered what can never be lost. I found what was always here, but was hidden by my attachment to what I thought I needed." Through the hardest winter of his life, living in makeshift shelters and eating the simplest food, Tenzin experienced a joy and contentment deeper than any he had known during his comfortable years in the monastery. He had learned to find abundance in scarcity, wealth in simplicity, security in uncertainty. When spring came and plans were made to rebuild the monastery, Tenzin chose to remain in the mountains, living in a simple cave and supporting himself through the generosity of local villagers. He had discovered that true richness had nothing to do with external conditions and everything to do with the grateful recognition of life's essential gifts. Years later, people would travel great distances to visit the monk who had learned to find treasure in catastrophe, and they would leave carrying something of his radiant appreciation for the simple miracle of being alive. This powerful story reveals how gratitude can become a transformative force that completely changes our relationship to life's difficulties. Tenzin's experience shows us that genuine appreciation is not dependent on favorable circumstances, but can actually flourish most brilliantly when outside conditions are most challenging. The earthquake that destroyed Tenzin's comfortable life also revealed something profound about the nature of happiness and security. As long as he was surrounded by familiar comforts, he couldn't see how much of his contentment came from sources that could never be threatened. It took the loss of everything external for him to discover the wealth that had always existed within his own being. This is what we might call the alchemy of gratitude. The mysterious process by which appreciation can transform even the most difficult experiences into sources of wisdom and strength. When we learn to feel grateful, not just for what we have, but for what we are, for the simple fact of being conscious and alive, we discover a source of joy that no external circumstance can touch. Tenzin's gratitude wasn't a denial of his loss or a pretense that the earthquake had been good. He genuinely grieved for his teacher and his fellow monks. He felt the difficulty of his new circumstances, but within this honest acknowledgement of pain, he found something else: profound appreciation for everything that remained, everything that was still possible, everything that could never be taken away. This kind of gratitude requires a fundamental shift in how we define abundance and security. Most of us have been conditioned to believe that we need certain external conditions to be happy: enough money, the right relationships, good health, comfortable living situations. When these conditions are threatened or lost, we feel that our well-being has been damaged. But Tenzin's experience points to a different understanding. True security comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from developing such deep appreciation for existence itself that we can find abundance regardless of what we possess materially. When we learn to be grateful for consciousness, for the ability to experience beauty, for the capacity to love and be loved, we tap into a source of wealth that no earthquake can destroy. This doesn't mean becoming passive about improving our circumstances or helping others who are suffering. Tenzin didn't stop working to create shelter and find food. He approached these practical tasks with a transformed heart. Gratitude doesn't eliminate the need for wise action. It transforms the spirit in which we act, replacing anxiety and grasping with appreciation and trust. The practice of transformative gratitude begins with recognizing what we usually take for granted: the fact that we can see color and hear music, the reality that we can think and feel and choose, the miracle that our hearts beat without our conscious control, that our bodies heal from injuries, that consciousness arises fresh each morning after the mysterious absence of sleep. When we really pay attention to these fundamental gifts, we begin to understand what Tenzin discovered. We are surrounded by abundance at every moment, but we usually focus on what we lack rather than appreciating what we have. This shift in attention is like discovering that we've been living in a palace while thinking we were in a prison. This kind of gratitude also extends to our difficulties and challenges. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because we can learn to appreciate how our struggles have contributed to our growth, our compassion, our wisdom. The relationship that ended taught us about our capacity for love. The job we lost forced us to discover hidden strengths. The illness showed us what really matters. When we can find genuine appreciation for the role that difficulties have played in shaping who we are, we discover what Tenzin found, that there are no purely negative experiences, only experiences we haven't yet learned to receive as gifts. This transformative gratitude naturally leads to what the Buddha called great compassion, the recognition that all beings are struggling with similar challenges, all seeking happiness, all deserving of kindness. When we're truly grateful for our own life, including its difficulties, we naturally want to help others find the same appreciation and peace. On the slopes of Mount Fuji, where cherry blossoms announced each spring with breathtaking beauty and ancient pilgrimage paths wound between groves of towering cedar trees, there lived an old man named Kenji, who had become known throughout the region as the Grateful Pilgrim. Kenji had not always been known for his appreciation and contentment. In his younger years, he had been a successful but restless businessman, always seeking the next opportunity, the next achievement, the next acquisition that might finally bring him lasting satisfaction. He had accumulated wealth, fame, and recognition, but somehow the happiness he sought remained elusive. Now at the age of 78, Kenji spent his days walking the ancient pilgrimage routes around Mount Fuji, not seeking anything particular, but simply appreciating the journey itself. Travelers who encountered him on the mountain paths were often struck by his radiant contentment and his ability to find wonder in the smallest details of each day. One spring morning, as Kenji rested beside a small shrine overlooking a valley filled with blooming cherry trees, he was approached by a young businessman named Hiroshi, who was clearly in distress. Hiroshi's expensive clothes were dusty from hurried travel. His face was lined with worry, and his constantly checking his mobile phone suggested a mind preoccupied with urgent concerns. "Honored elder," Hiroshi said, bowing respectfully but impatiently, "I have heard that you are known for wisdom about finding peace. I desperately need guidance. My business is failing. My marriage is troubled. My health is suffering from stress. Everything in my life seems to be falling apart, and I don't know what to do." Kenji listened with the patient attention of someone who had learned to be fully present with others' suffering. When Hiroshi finished describing his difficulties, the old man was quiet for several minutes, simply watching the cherry blossoms drift on the morning breeze. "Tell me," Kenji said finally, "about your journey up the mountain this morning. What did you notice on your way here?" Hiroshi looked puzzled. I was focused on reaching you as quickly as possible. I didn't really notice anything specific." "I see," Kenji said with gentle understanding. "And yesterday, before you decided to seek me out, what did you notice about that day?" "Yesterday was terrible," Hiroshi replied immediately. "More bad news about the business. Another argument with my wife. A visit to the doctor that raised more concerns about my blood pressure. Nothing good happened at all." Kenji nodded thoughtfully. "Nothing good," he repeated softly. "Tell me, did you eat yesterday?" "Well, yes, but..." "And did you sleep last night?" "Yes, though not well." "And when you woke this morning, were you able to breathe freely?" "Of course, but I don't understand what." "And on your climb up the mountain today, did your legs carry you where you wanted to go?" Hiroshi was beginning to see where this was leading. "Yes, they did." "And your eyes," Kenji continued gently, "were they able to see the path, the trees, the sky?" "Yes." "And when you speak to me now, can you hear my words, and can I hear yours?" Yes. But what does this have to do with my problems? Kenji smiled with infinite kindness. My young friend, you told me that nothing good happened yesterday, and yet yesterday you received thousands of gifts so basic and essential that life would be impossible without them. You've been surrounded by miracles, so constant that you've stopped noticing them. He gestured toward the vista spread before them. In your urgency to reach me, you walked past countless cherry blossoms that will never exist again in exactly this form. You missed the sound of birds welcoming the morning, the feel of cool mountain air filling your lungs, the simple miracle of being alive on a spring day on this beautiful mountain. Hiroshi looked around as if seeing his surroundings for the first time. The view was indeed spectacular, the sacred mountain rising majestically against a clear blue sky. The valley below carpeted with pink and white blossoms, the ancient forest extending in all directions like a green sea. I've been so focused on my problems, Hiroshi said slowly, that I've been blind to everything else. This is the human condition, Kenji replied with compassion. We become so absorbed in what we lack, what we've lost, what we fear might happen, that we miss the abundance that surrounds us in every moment. We're like people dying of thirst while standing in a clear mountain stream. Over the next hour, Kenji shared the story of his own transformation. He described how his relentless pursuit of success had left him feeling empty and exhausted, how a heart attack at age 55 had forced him to reconsider what really mattered, how he had gradually learned to find contentment not by changing his circumstances, but by changing how he related to whatever circumstances he encountered. I spent 40 years of my life waiting to be happy, Kenji said, as they watched clouds drift across the mountain peaks. Waiting for the next promotion, the next acquisition, the next achievement that would finally bring me satisfaction. But happiness was always just out of reach, always dependent on something that hadn't happened yet. He picked up a small stone from the path and held it in his weathered palm. One day, sitting in a hospital bed after my heart attack, I realized that I had been looking for treasure in some distant place, while ignoring the jewels scattered at my feet. I began to practice something very simple. Each morning, before thinking about my problems or my goals, I would spend a few minutes appreciating things that were so basic, I had always taken them for granted. What kinds of things? Hiroshi asked. The fact that I had survived another night and awakened to a new day, the reality that I could move my fingers and toes, that my senses were functioning, that I had access to clean water and nourishing food, the miracle that there were people in the world who loved me, even though I had often been too busy to fully appreciate their love. Kenji continued his practice right there on the mountain path, pointing out gifts that were immediately available, the sound of insects humming in the forest, evidence of countless small lives flourishing around them, the feel of solid earth beneath their bodies supporting them completely, the fact that they could communicate with words, sharing thoughts and feelings across the space between minds. The practice is simple, Kenji explained, but it changes everything. When you start each day by acknowledging gifts you normally ignore, you discover that you're surrounded by abundance. Your problems don't disappear, but they stop feeling like the entire story of your life. Hiroshi spent the rest of the day walking with Kenji, learning to notice what had always been there, but had become invisible through familiarity. The old man's capacity for appreciation was contagious. By evening, Hiroshi found himself genuinely marveling at things he had never paid attention to before. Will this solve my business problems? Hiroshi asked as they prepared to part ways. Gratitude is not a magic formula for eliminating difficulties, Kenji replied, but it will change how you meet those difficulties. When you're grounded in appreciation for what you have, you make decisions from clarity rather than desperation. When you remember how much support is already available to you, you approach challenges with confidence rather than fear. 6 months later, Hiroshi returned to Mount Fuji to thank the old pilgrim. His external circumstances had indeed changed. Some problems resolved, others accepted, all approached with a fundamentally different spirit. But more importantly, he had discovered what Kenji had found. That happiness was not something to be achieved in the future, but something to be recognized in the present, hidden in plain sight among the ordinary miracles of daily existence. This concluding story brings together all the wisdom we have explored on our journey together, showing how gratitude becomes the natural culmination of deep understanding about the nature of life and consciousness. Kenji's transformation illustrates something profound about human happiness. We spend most of our lives seeking satisfaction in future achievements while overlooking the abundance that surrounds us in every moment. This is not because we're foolish or ungrateful by nature, but because our minds are conditioned to focus on problems and deficiencies rather than gifts and blessings. The practice that Kenji taught Hiroshi, beginning each day by acknowledging usually invisible gifts, is one of the most powerful ways to cultivate the kind of appreciation that can transform our entire relationship to life. When we regularly notice what we typically take for granted, our breathing, our senses, our ability to think and feel, the people who love us, we begin to understand that we are immersed in abundance at every moment. This awareness naturally leads to what we might call foundational gratitude, appreciation for existence itself, rather than just for favorable circumstances. When we're grateful at this fundamental level, our happiness becomes much more stable because it's based on what is always available rather than on what comes and goes. This brings us full circle to where our journey began, with the understanding that true peace comes from within rather than from external conditions. All the practices we have explored together, developing firm purpose, becoming emotionally untouchable, protecting our inner garden, transforming fear and shame, learning from every encounter, living ethically, flowing with natural rhythms, all of these culminate in the recognition that we already have everything we need for contentment. When Tenzin lost everything in the earthquake, he discovered that his deepest treasures could never be taken away. When Kenji stopped chasing future happiness, he found that fulfillment had been present all along, disguised as ordinary experience. This is the ultimate teaching that the peace we seek is not something we must create or achieve, but something we can recognize right now in this moment with whatever circumstances we are currently experiencing. This doesn't mean pretending that difficulties don't exist or that all circumstances are equally pleasant. It means discovering the layer of appreciation that can coexist with any external condition. We can feel grateful for our capacity to love even when we're experiencing heartbreak. We can appreciate our body's resilience even when we're dealing with illness. We can be thankful for our ability to learn and grow, even when we're facing challenging lessons. The practice that integrates everything we have learned is beautifully simple. Regularly return your attention to what is working, what is supporting you, what gifts are present in this moment that you might normally overlook. This doesn't require any special circumstances or achievements. It can be done anywhere, anytime, with whatever you are experiencing right now. As our time together draws to a close, you might notice this practice naturally arising. Perhaps you feel grateful for having the opportunity to explore these teachings, for the quietness of this moment, for the simple fact that you can rest and reflect. Perhaps you appreciate your breathing, steady and reliable without any effort on your part. Perhaps you feel thankful for whatever supports you right now, the surface beneath you, the shelter around you, the peace that is available in this very instant. This capacity for appreciation is always accessible. It doesn't depend on perfect circumstances or special achievements. It's available in moments of joy and in moments of difficulty, in times of success and in times of struggle. When you remember this, you carry with you a source of contentment that no external circumstance can disturb. The Buddha spent his life pointing toward this simple recognition that the peace we seek is not far away, but intimately close, not complex, but elegantly simple, not reserved for special people, but available to every conscious being. All the techniques and teachings are just different ways of removing the obstacles we place between ourselves and the natural contentment that is our birthright. Tonight, as you settle into rest, you can practice this ultimate teaching. Instead of focusing on what you need to do tomorrow or what problems need solving, you can simply appreciate this moment of peace. Feel grateful for the opportunity to rest, for the natural process that will restore your body and mind while you sleep, for the simple miracle of being alive and aware. Let this appreciation be the last conscious experience of your day. Allow yourself to feel genuinely thankful for the journey we have taken together, for the wisdom traditions that have preserved these teachings across centuries, for your own willingness to explore what it means to live with greater peace and understanding. And as you drift towards sleep, carry with you the recognition that this contentment, this sense of completion and gratitude is always available to you, not because you have achieved something special or learned complicated techniques, but because appreciation is the natural response of awareness when it recognizes its own inherent fullness. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you have everything you need for happiness right here, right now, in the simple fact of being conscious and alive. Rest in gratitude and let this recognition of abundance carry you gently through the night. Thank you for walking this path with me. May these teachings bring you lasting peace. And may you remember in each moment the extraordinary gift of being exactly who you are, exactly where you are, exactly when you are. The journey continues with each conscious breath, each moment of awareness, each choice to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. Welcome home to the peace that has been waiting for you all along. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here.